Welcome to the Trustees meeting for the University of Oregon. I think, Madam Secretary, we'll start with a roll call.
Okay. Marcia Aaron. Here. Connie Palmer.
Walking in the door.
Perfect. Peter Bragdon is absent. Andrew Polis.
Here.
And Curry is absent. Alan Ford.
Here.
Joe Gagne.
Here.
Russ Carey.
Here.
Chair Lillis.
Here.
Laura Lee McIntyre.
Here.
Jimmy Murray.
Here.
Will Costume.
Here.
Vice Chair Ralph.
Here.
President Schill.
Here.
Mary Wilcox.
Here.
Thank you. And we have a quorum. And let's look at the December meeting minutes, December 2018. We need approval of those, or
I will move it.
I'll second.
are there any additions, subtractions, modifications? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, we're going to start the public comment section if I have the list. All right. David, are you here? Did I see you? Okay. He's not here. Huh?
Yeah, there he is in the front row.
Okay, David, we're ready. I didn't see you. I'm sorry, I didn't see you there.
Oh, that's quite all right. Well, I guess we can get to the point we can speak as old friends at this point. I'm speaking today. Can you hear me?
Just,
Is it on?
No, this isn't good.
I don't think.
Speak loudly.
All right. At the time of the denaming of Dunn Hall, Mr. Schill promised that there would be documentation placed around the former Dunn Hall.
I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's my fault. I'll speak up. At the time of the denaming of Dunn Hall, Mr. Schill promised that there would be documentation placed around the former Dunn Hall explaining the history of the denaming. 2.5 years later, no signs are present. It is time for the true story to be told. It is time for those signs to be erected. Dunn Hall was denamed as a result of a disgraceful process that relied upon the use of a thoroughly discredited process report, as well as the additional falsehoods presented by Michael Schill. The Fraternal Order KKK was presented as a secret, violent, white supremacist organization, as if it were one of the other KKK groups in history using the same name, and its local chapter was allegedly led for years by Professor Dunn. Mr. Schill added to the ridiculous report his own fabrications that included the statement that the Klan had lynched Catholics and Jews. The Fraternal Order KKK didn't lynch anyone. In fact, the original violent post-Civil War KKK groups not only didn't lynch Jews, it included them in its membership. Today, understandably, the general public assumes that there is implicitly anti-black hatred in any group in history that used the name that included KKK. They don't have the actual history of the KKK Fraternal Order in mind. In 1921, the term KKK did not have the mental associations that it has today. The odious post-World War II KKK groups had not come into history, and the post-Civil War KKK had been presented in the racist blockbuster movie Birth of a Nation as benign. The Fraternal Order KKK in the 1920s was a lawfully incorporated fraternal order. It was operated by disingenuous, money-motivated hustlers who sought to milk their membership of money through dues, sales of goods, and special assessments. The Kleagle sales representatives came to Eugene in the summer of 1921, and they operated the chapter in its initial years, not the local chapter head. Their initial sales pitch was that they would support law and order. In other words, they would support the new federal law of prohibition, not anti-Catholicism. Within the first few months of their arrival, in order to attract the lesser lights of the community, they began spewing wild anti-Catholic stories, and many outstanding local members, including Professor Dunn and U of O football coach Shai Huntington, dropped out. In Eugene, the anti-Catholic story was that the U of O was run by secret Jesuit priests and that almost all of the student body and faculty were Catholics. This means that they would have also been claiming that the secret priests were sexually abusing the secret nuns of the University of Oregon. Had Professor Dunn actually been involved in this crooked money hustle, the community would have known about it and there would have been much comment about it. But in fact, there is no record of this in history, of this story that was promoted by Michael Schill. The U of O president Arthur Fleming would never have created a Dunn Hall in 1962 had Schill's fairy tale been true. I urge the presentation of the true story of the ignorance and bigotry, not of the virtuous Professor Dunn, but of Michael Schill. Thank you. Also, I wanted to have something fun for you. This is the 1919, this is the very first picture of anyone associated with the Fraternal Order of the Klan. And it's in Atlanta, and it's allegedly participants in a parade of Confederate war veterans. The interesting thing about this photo is the men under the robes are African Americans. Now, there's an explanation. Feel free to contact me. I'll tell you about it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And the next person signed up is Louis Vidmer. Welcome.
Thank you. President Schill, Board of Trustees, my name is Louis Vidmar. I am the president of SEIU Sublocal 085, representing approximately 1,600 classified workers here at the university. I myself am an IT consultant in the College of Design. I also graduated from the U of O in 2009, so I'm an alum as well as a current employee, and I care deeply for this university. Higher education is facing unprecedented challenges. Tuition rates are climbing, the student loan crisis is soaring, and our public universities are seeing less investment with each passing year. We can all agree the legislature needs to increase their investment in higher education. We are working in partnership with the university presidents to make student success and support a priority in this legislative session. Our members are dealing with this on a personal level. Though the economy is in a stronger place than during any contract negotiation in a decade, classified staff are falling further behind. The cost of basic necessities like food and utilities are soaring. The cost of housing is creeping steadily out of reach for many of our members. Our wages have not kept up with these rising costs, and we are at a breaking point. Classified staff should not have to make a choice between paying the bills and putting food on the table, but these are the choices that many of us have to make every day. According to the charts in your packet for this meeting, U of O's tuition is about average for its AAU comparables, yet we are below average for the number of faculty. We fall in the bottom quintile for non-faculty staff, and we are third from the bottom in state appropriations per student. We plan to work with you to increase revenue, ensuring funding for higher education in our state, to continue providing quality services for our campus community and ensure students get the best experience during their time on our campus. Without taking on crippling amounts of debt, we must secure revenue. Day by day, we help students build their future at the U of O. We know that students who are supported are more likely to achieve a degree. We play a critical role in providing this support. We matter for student success. We ask for a fair contract that maintains healthcare and allows us to provide for ourselves and our families within Oregon's constantly rising cost of living. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lori. There are no other people signed up for public comment, so we'll close the public comment session. And we'll turn to the various reports. Maria, are you here? Maria? Okay, the ASUO report, presidential report. Hello and welcome.
Good morning. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
perfect.
great. My name is Maria Gallegos Chacon. I represent ASUO Student Body President, and I have kind of a lengthy update for y'all today. So if you want to follow along, that's understandable. This is also written by myself and my VP Dorsey and Chen. So there's like a little bit of a different style of writing for each tier. So starting off with tuition, as you all know, the TFAB recommended 2.97%. After roughly 15 weeks of our TFAB committee, we decided that we can live with 2.97% increase on non-resident tuition. We saw it fit that this increase would be not too drastic so that it wouldn't impede students' lives and cause them to drop out, and also stay within the market for our Pac-12 competitors and state schools. We have a complex of understanding of why tuition goes up. However, we feel there should be another advisory board added to also advise on how to mitigate the increased cost and how to support students through these hikes. The advisory board would be available to brainstorm and plan through campus growth, scholarships, legislative strategies, and other types of aid. We recognize that TFAB is not the place to discuss all ideas and issues, but we do not think you can have a holistic conversation around tuition without considering all the intersecting factors. And this would look like talking about how, like, campus planning growth plans, like what's going to attract other students, how much to add for financial aid. I know Jamie mentioned that each year when tuition goes up, we add about 10% to scholarships, but I think there is room to add a few percentage points there as well. So that was on Amani's part. I'll come back to legislative. So we're going to go down to food insecurity. And there's a lot of numbers here. So what we wanted to highlight is that we're receiving over 1,000 applications almost each week. And the way Ducks Feeding Ducks works is you just log in and give your 951 number and say that you want to receive $10 for the term, essentially. And then students can use those $10 to get a meal here in the EMU, essentially. So $10 obviously isn't a lot. I believe Chipotle is the most popular. You can see in our stats here. But Chipotle is also about $8 if you were to get no meat. So that is clear to us that it's great that students are using it, but we are running out of funds. And $10 really isn't a substantial amount to mitigate hunger. I think it alleviates some of the pressure for a week, because if you don't use it within that week, it goes back into the fund. But I think what we wanted to show with our numbers is that there's a lot of students who are using it, and there's a lot of reoccurring students who are using it. So that means that we're tapping into the right pool of students who actually do need support. So yeah, we're ASU. My administration is going to put through $10,000 to continue the support for the food alleviation programs, and then we're submitting a budget proposal that's going to ask for roughly $86,300 to the budget advisory group. So keep an eye out for that. But I think it's important to stress, just like as someone mentioned earlier, considering like wages on this campus and stipends aren't high, considering that tuition is going up, there's inflation, the increased cost of living is going up, and I think we have to figure out ways on how to be sustainable for students who are of low income or lower class, middle class. As for the legislative update, I've been working with Libby and Hans on this, but my team and I have been working very hard to be at the Capitol as much as possible to testify before the HEC and lobby officials and provide insight to our government affairs office. This update is a little old, so I'm going to go beyond this, but right now it seems as though there's an uphill battle to win over state funding that actually invests in students. We did have a successful Oregon Student Association lobby day in terms of turnout, which we had roughly 30 U of O students out of 100 college and university students. The general sentiment that came from legislators is that they want to support students. They want to support students, but have some barriers to support. For some, it seems as though they don't want to come out against publicly through K through 12 funding. So I think we can change that by saying we're not against K through 12 funding, and I think I can rely on all of you all when you're talking to legislators to say that it's cradle to career. And then I think some of it is just stressing the other fact is that there seems to be a bad trust between this university particularly and the state. I've worked all 4 years on lobbying for tuition, but not probably this intensely. And what I'm learning more and more is that there seems to be like a bad reputation of the institution amongst the state. So representatives like Julie Fahey, who actually kind of represents this area, is uncomfortable with supporting revenue for higher ed because she's not sure if she sees genuine support for students from UO admin and the Board of Trustees. She made that very, very clear, and I relayed that to President Schill so that we could like work around building that trust. But I think she made it clear that she wants to know if revenue is going to be including higher ed, that she has to know that the money is going to students like tuition affordability and aid. I think this can be mitigated by making sure students are included in the decision-making processes and what their needs are, and working more closely with the Oregon Student Association and on tuition affordability. And then furthermore, we're also working on some priority bills that I would also encourage you all to support. One of them is the Tuition Equity 4.0, which would make resources available for undocumented students, even to higher ed. Licenses for all is also another issue that impacts our students. As of currently, undocumented Oregonians can't legally drive without a license, so this would free that up a little bit. And then we are supporting a bill to disarm campus police, which I understand is controversial, and I also understand that this board has approved it in the past. But to that, I will say we are planning some educational events that I would welcome all of you to come, and I think there's room to have conversations as to why students feel that campus police shouldn't be armed. I think this is an issue that touches mostly to marginalized students of color, students with disabilities, and houseless students. And I think before we get too argumentative, I think there's an opportunity for all of you to learn. And I'm assuming that most of you maybe have not considered that before. So if you want to talk about it, Angela has my contact information, and I would be happy to walk you all through kind of our thought process on this and the general resentment that students are feeling, because there is, I would warn, there is a disarm campus movement happening, and I think the way you come out ahead of that is by supporting and listening to your students. Any questions?
Maria, thank you again for, as you always have, writing and giving us your report in advance. That's terrific, and as always, well done. Any questions for Maria?
I was just curious about when you're talking with representatives, just you mentioned that they don't, some had expressed concerns that we aren't utilizing the money in the correct way, like in supporting students. And I was curious if you talked to other students at our universities who are hearing similar concerns, or if it's specific to just here, and then maybe where they think we're misusing those funds.
Right. I think, well, so we're a member campus of the Oregon Student Association, so I lobby on the behalf of like some community colleges and some other smaller campuses. And I think the general kind of maybe feeling is that, and maybe this could be fixed through education of legislators too, but they see us building $1 billion campus. And I understand that tuition's not going towards that, but I think sometimes they see like our priorities being like maybe a little jumbled as to why we are asking for revenue, but then at the same time, like looking to expand like Hayward Field is something that came up, which I tried to explain that those are two separate funds. And so I think the other issue too is that they don't understand why, if there was budget cuts, why that would harm students. And so we're trying to also explain as to why, if you cut our staff like and faculty, why that would generally hurt students, but also, we're also like trying to represent the unions in our discussions as well, because I don't think it would be fair to just go there and represent students. I also consider like SEIU folks and like the GTFF, as they are also a lot of times directly working with students. So I think that's the main thing. So I think there's a little bit just of a narrative that we have to fix, and then also working more closely with like unions and folks to show that we are making huge budget cuts. This will impact students pretty negatively. And I don't think that legislators have necessarily that breadth of understanding sometimes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a little startling that a local legislator feels like she doesn't know what's going on, just to be candid.
Yeah, that seems to be the theme. A lot of local legislators were like trying to win over. But I think that means that all of you should also be reaching out and, talking about how, if we get the revenue, how that's going to directly affect students. And so I know Will Paulston has some ideas on that, but I'll let you get to that eventually. But yeah, I think it's not discouraging. We're working on it.
Great. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
As always. Bill Harbaugh, are you ready? Yep. Okay. University Senate President. I think all of you know Bill. And thank you for your report in advance as well, Bill.
Welcome. So hi, everyone. Let's see. First, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Scouron, who's in the back there and is the Senate VP and will be the Senate President next year. So she'll be delivering these reports in the future, and I hope working with you. So I want to, I've given you the written comments. I'll give you a quick run through of them, and I'm very happy to take questions afterwards. So I want to say a little bit about shared governance. This is actually a quote that I got from a book that President Schill sent me. He sends me a lot of books, some of them which I read. This one I had to buy on Amazon so that I could get text that I could paste in. So this is a quote from a former president of Princeton about shared governance, and he says, simplistic as it may sound, we believe that shared governance should be viewed not so much in terms of who owns what, but as embracing a commitment to a genuine sharing of perspectives, to the avoidance of constituency-based thinking, to the extent that this can be done. What is most needed on the part of all parties, including both faculty and administrators, is not just willingness to reject we versus they thinking, but an eagerness to embrace good ideas generated by others. Such mutual openness to good ideas from all sources should be accompanied by recognition that nimble decision-making is required, and that this requires a well-established locus of authority. Okay, so this is a call for increased participation in decision-making while keeping the actual authority of that decision-making in the hands of the president and the board. So this is basically what the Senate does, is try to operationalize this kind of definition of good governance. We try to work with our constituents, we try to work with the students, we try to work with the administration, and we really should be trying to work more with y'all to try to accomplish this and make sure that the decisions that you're helping guide the administration in are made, with consideration of all the various constituents groups, not just their interests, but their specific knowledge about things. I've read through your self-evaluations, and it's clear that many of you understand that you're not experts in this, and that it's clear from the evaluations you're looking for more expertise. But I don't think you're getting that in the normal course of your meetings and stuff. So I would encourage you to do more outreach to the faculty and the students. And as Senate President, I'm always very happy to help try to set that up. If you want to come to a Senate meeting or a Senate executive meeting, talk a little bit about things to see what's going on. Tell us what things are like from your perspective. We'd be really open to that. Okay, so I'm hoping that we can do that in a more systematic way, and I'll talk with Angela about trying to get that done. So a few other things that I want to say that are about operationalizing this, principle of good shared governance. Faculty and Senate participation in the hiring and review of academic administrators. So it used to be the case that when we hired a new dean or an assistant vice provost, that sort of thing, there would be an open search, maybe a national search, maybe just the job opening would be posted for current UO employees to apply for. But it would be public that there was a job opening and that people could apply to this. In recent years, the university's understanding or its explanation of its affirmative action obligations has changed, and we no longer require those open searches as a rule. And that has meant that there's really no organized process in many cases for faculty and Senate participation in the hiring decisions. So the Senate is going to write legislation this spring to try to correct that situation and try to formalize the procedure by which we'll have input into these things. This is not meant as an attack on the president's authority or anything like that. It's just meant as an effort to make sure that we have a clear policy that we can all agree to and that we can implement in practice. Another thing that speaks to this question of good governance is the College of Arts and Sciences Potential Reorganization Task Force. So as you know, the CAS is the largest part by far of the university, and our dean quit, I think it was in November. because he was unhappy with the degree of central control, and while he liked some parts of that central control, other parts of it he thought were micromanaging him, and he is now out interviewing for jobs as president at other universities. So in the wake of that, President Schill and Provost Benavar proposed considering reorganizing CAS, and I think the main proposal was to split it up into 2 colleges, one for sciences, somehow attach the night campus to that, and then have another college for humanities and the social sciences. So he established a task force of, I think, 24 people. The Senate was allowed to appoint only 2 of its members, which didn't make us very happy. I was worried this would be kind of a whitewash committee, but having been to their meetings, they're definitely not whitewashing anything. They are extremely skeptical of this proposal and where it came from and what motivated it. And I'm sure President Schill is tired of their repeated questions, why are you making us do this? I have a lot of faith in that committee now, and my hope is that rather than come back with a proposal to just reorganize things for reorganization's sake, they'll come back with a group of faculty now, department heads and so forth, who really understand the correct way to organize colleges like CAS and what works and what doesn't work, and that they will be able to make suggestions that will not be expensive proposals to hire more deans, but instead will be ways to make the current organizational structure function better. So I've asked President Schill if he would sort of redirect the committee's charge in that direction, and he hasn't said yes yet, but he will. Other things that the Senate has been up to, new academic programs and courses. You heard from the Department of Academic Studies. We approved that program in the Senate. It was very well documented. I think you guys had some good questions, but really that was an example of a PhD proposal where there's a solid job market for the people coming out of it. It was sort of funny in the Senate where people from some of the departments were asking, wait a minute, 70% of graduates are going to get academic jobs? These are departments now where PhD, like 25% of the PhD graduates are getting academic jobs. So that was very convincing, and I'm glad that you I guess you haven't approved it yet, your committee has. So we did that. We also did an online version of the sports product management and so forth. So that's just standard kind of stuff that we do. Talk to you a bunch about teaching evaluations. I know I don't have a lot of time here. I want to let me know if I'm going on too long, Chuck, but I want to say a little bit about the teaching evaluations because we're involved in a several-year project to redo those. That project is working very well. We've got excellent support from the administration on it, and I have to say that Sierra Dawson from the Provost's office is really doing the bulk of the work on this, and just been great working with her. So we are going to come back to the Senate and have a system of evaluating teaching and of encouraging good teaching that will be far better than the current system that we have. And it's not going to be perfect when we start, but the bar for the current system is so low that it's almost inconceivable for me to see that we won't be able to make a substantial improvement pretty quickly. So I won't go into all the problems with the current evaluations other than say that they're biased against women. They're negatively correlated with what students actually learn in a class, believe it or not, and yet we're using them to give merit raises. It's crazy. We're going to stop it and replace it with something better. We're going to do that pretty quickly. There's a great story in the Chronicle of Higher Ed about the University of Oregon's efforts to do that, and since that came out, we've heard from more and more colleges that are also interested in copying what we are doing. So I think we're part of a movement here now. Core Gen Ed, we're still working forward on that. We've made some changes to our general education requirements, our multicultural requirements, to sort of rationalize them, simplify them, and Danica Scott is working on a proposal to sort of revamp parts of the first-year curriculum as part of this proposal, and that seems to be very well designed. If you read the Chronicle of Higher Education, there was a story a couple days ago about how badly the University of Texas at Austin screwed this one up by trying to make huge changes all at once. We're doing an incremental approach, and we've changed a few things already, and as time goes on, we'll change more of them. Conflict of interest and commitment policy. So this is the policy that governs, conflicts of interest in the sense that you're doing something that costs the university money, and conflicts of commitment in the sense that you're doing something that takes time that you really should be devoting to your university work. And this proposal came out about a year ago to redo this, I think from the General Counsel's office. It was a very legalistic interpretation of state law, and one that did not recognize the importance of outside work for recruiting good faculty, for keeping good faculty, for getting the ideas that come out of a university out into the community. That's how you do it. You get an idea, you set up a little business, or you do some consulting, stuff like that. Those are how the university has an impact on the larger community. And so over the past year, we've rewritten this policy in a way that encourages that kind of entrepreneurial activity from the faculty. And I think we would have passed that last week, but there was a snowstorm, so next week. Sexual and romantic relationships policy. This one we spent a lot of time on, like 4 years. And the end result is a slight change to the current policy. It bans relationships between faculty, actually all UO supervisory employees, but faculty and students, basically students in their department. Okay, so there were some on the committee that would have liked to have banned all relationships between faculty and undergraduates. We were told that that was probably illegal under the Constitution's free association rules. It's not really in the Constitution, but it's been interpreted that way. So I think this is probably the strongest policy that we could legally come up with in terms of limiting these relationships. Then last thing I want to say a little bit about is the academic continuity plan. This was motivated by the graduate teaching fellows strike in 2014, and I know you were around when that happened. It was the graduate students strategically went on strike at the end of the quarter, and there was mass confusion amongst the faculty and the university administration and everyone, the students, as to how they were going to get grades, whether they were going to get grades, and what consequences that might have for financial aid and for international students for their visas. The university lawyers, not the university's lawyers, but the lawyers that the university had hired, sort of strategically played up that uncertainty about financial aid and visa status with students in order to try to pressure the graduate students to end their strike. And that was pretty unfortunate. We don't want to see that happen again. So the faculty, with the strong encouragement of the administration, has been rewriting or actually creating a policy on academic continuity. And this will get passed very soon in some form. It creates emergency grades. It has a faculty committee that decides if it's time to use emergency grades. So you imagine there's a strike in the last week of the quarter. The academic council, which is a Senate committee, could vote to authorize the use of emergency grades. They would then be given to everybody, all the students. That would satisfy their financial aid and visa requirements. So that would reduce the fear quite a bit. And then once the strike or earthquake or whatever it is over, the academic council would decide, well, okay, can we now go back to regular grades and get faculty to, finish up the term, or what? Or are we just going to keep the emergency ones as make them permanent like that? So it's a very sensible system, and it, most importantly, it keeps the authority for issuing grades in the hands of the faculty, which is a very important thing for our academic accreditors. I think that's all I've got for you. Any questions?
Are there questions for Bill? I have a couple if nobody else does. Does the University Senate have a working definition of student success?
The Senate is going to have Danica come to talk with us in spring. We're going to have a sort of retreat about student success efforts in general. I've worked a lot with Danica over the past couple of years on student success research projects, So I have a pretty good definition. I don't think the Senate is really that knowledgeable about things like, retention, 4-year, 6 graduation rates, that kind of stuff. It's they should be, and we're going to try to get them up to speed on it.
Terrific. I think it's Mike Schill and I have talked about this a number of times. I think this is something that the board, the topic student success, which I think may each have a little bit different definition at the moment, is so important that I'm anxious to hear anyone's thoughts and ideas, and I guess we'll probably have a presentation from someone soon on that subject. Okay. A second question and I think this is a fair question for the University Senate, is as I read the news these days, increasingly high schools are giving university credit, and increasingly community colleges are giving 4-year degrees. And I don't know exactly what the situation is in the state of Oregon, but for some of us, from the old school, I suppose, it raises all sorts of questions about quality and purpose and intent and justification, et cetera. Is this a subject that the University Senate is interested in, has thought about, will think about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it is, and it's one that we're actually engaged in now with actually Elizabeth has been up to Salem to testify on, SB of 160 or something like that, which is sort of dumbing down the requirements for getting college credit for high school classes. There are a couple other bills like that, in addition to the community college ones. And so, we keep an eye on that. We also keep an eye on it through the Interinstitutional Faculty Senate, which is the presidents of all the senates, kind of like the provost of the President's Council. And that group has a committee on legislative affairs that, talks to the legislatures and testifies at hearings and so forth. And that's really the focus of their work, is those kinds of questions. Can I ask you a question?
You mean President Schill?
No, I think I mean you.
Oh, well, I'll tell you after I hear it.
Okay, I'll ask it. When we switched from an OUS system to separate boards, I don't know the history of this, but my sense is that when we had an OUS system, when the legislators came up with some crazy idea like, let's teach college classes in high school, the OUS system pushed back, and that would be the end of it. For 40 years, somehow the OUS board managed to keep these things separate. Angela's laughing at me, and
Not at you, with you.
Okay, so now we've broken up. We've got our own separate boards. I'm not aware of your individual participation in lobbying the legislator against this stuff. I know that the university has lobbyists who do that. That's a little different than having politically appointed, people, trustees, go in and tell the legislature this is a bad idea. And it's a little different than having a group of them. Have you considered having, the chairs of the individual boards of trustees, assemble and show up at some of these hearings for some of these crazier ideas?
To the best of my knowledge, we have not considered organizing the chairs to do something in a unified way, though all of the chairs have on various occasions visited with various legislators and the governor and other people. I'm going to turn this over to Alan Ford in a minute because he was on that board. He just left. How clever of Alan. But I will tell you that now, and maybe Mike wants to address this, the presidents of the universities and the provosts of the universities work in coordination with our various legislative personnel to to present a unified front on some subjects. And I would say my impression is on most subjects, the leaders of the various universities are aligned. So I think is it more effective? Here, my guess is it's going to be more effective because just the knowledge of higher education and the horsepower brought by the presidents, say, of the universities, enormously exceeds what we had when we had one board. You know, you have to remember we didn't really have any university presidents on that board. So I think you raise an interesting question. It might be different than the last, but I think the presidents are addressing that. I think the other question of do we have lobbyists is a very interesting question.
Well, I'm not worried about the lobbyists. I'm worried about, you know, you yourselves showing up and talking to the legislature.
Well, I think
lobbyists, unless they've got money to pass out, they're not going to get a whole lot of attention, right?
Gosh, a lobbyist with money, that'd be
I think,
an interesting idea.
so we can turn to, I mean, Hans is here to provide OUS context, which is one thing to put on the table, if I might, is there is somebody who was often on the receiving end of being lobbied once upon a time. The guidance that the presidents give to trustees, the trustees do engage. The guidance we get is that actually, contrary to what the assumption in your question, sometimes the trustees, the politically appointed boards, are actually not the most effective or best messengers. So we try to weigh, and in fact, Hans could verify this, but I believe faculty are actually the best messenger for academic messages. So we try to weigh the strategy about who's in Salem and when based on what we know to be effective for individual folks. But Hans can give more background on the OUS.
Do you want to answer his question first?
Well, let me just before Hans goes, just talk about the presidents for a moment and the provost. So we have an organization called the Council of Presidents, and we generally act with unanimity, and on most of these issues, we, on virtually every issue, we're able to reach a consensus. And I think that your point's an interesting one, and it's partly it's an empirical question, right? About did a public system is that better able to push back on both legislators and people in government? I mean, when I look at what I came into, if that's success, I don't know what failure is. Basically our funding already was at the very bottom of universities and in the country, and we've actually done better under the current board structure than we had done in terms of funding there, and partly
economic growth might add a little bit to do with that.
Yeah, but economic growth. But I'm talking about a 20-year period of cuts, and which you railed against, quite vociferously, and you were very unhappy with OUS. But I'll let you speak for yourself. Also the fact that we were kept from having degrees that we wanted. We were, basically lower common denominator. We ended up with a system where OIT and Southern get more per student than we do. I know you think I whine about that, but there's something to whine about sometimes. Not all whiners
are. At the moment, I'm trying to convince you to whine more.
Right. So I know, and believe me, I do constantly, and it hurts me when I hear Maria tell us that our own delegation is not supporting us in the way that they should. And we've been trying to rectify that. But then back to your question, we involve board members in meetings sometimes. So say, for example, when we meet with the legislative leaders, we typically have board members come to those meetings with the presidents. When we meet with the governor, as we've done twice this year, neither one of which was particularly good news, but we had board representation along with presidential representation. So it wasn't the whole board. It was generally one board member in one president going in. So people do that. But I think that, that doesn't to suggest that we wouldn't be better if we had more. And I would amend Angela's statement just one way. The students are also a fabulous source of information. Sometimes legislators view presidents as being self-interested in terms of, of course, what are we supposed to be doing? We're there arguing the case of our institutions, but the faculty and the students. But last comment, and I'll throw it back over to Hans because I think it's a good conversation. There are just an extraordinary number of bills that are dropped.
That's crazy.
And it is crazy, and the ideas are crazy some of the times, and we have to organize. Hans and Libby have to basically be defending us against these ideas, and some of them pass. Right? If you're not looking, some of them pass because they sound good, and then they cost us millions of dollars to deal with, as well as take away what you and I would agree are the prerogatives of the faculty. So it is quite difficult. But Hans, would you like to go on?
Yeah, just a couple things to add. One of the things that we try and remind presidents and others of is when legislators are talking about issues of transfer and dual credit, we have to remember that they're seeing it through the lens of constituents who are emailing them saying, my son or daughter took this class, promised that it would transfer, went to a university or community college, and then discovered it didn't, and now we feel as though that money has been wasted. That said, I think since the advent of the independent governing boards, the amount of legislative conversation around dual credit transfer has gone up significantly in the last 3 to 5 years. And I will take this opportunity, and I will probably regret this, but I will say, Libby and I have on numerous occasions reached out to sort of the coordinated faculty representatives and asked for more higher level of engagement on some of these academic bills, only to find a lack of response or not showing up or not engaging, candidly. And to a certain extent, the presidents, Mike, ourselves, can carry the message only so far. And then when it really comes to those core issues of academic, classroom, instructional issues that are core to the university function, Jayanth and his counterparts can help carry that message. But it really is the faculty. And, whether it's AAUP, AFS, or the interinstitutional faculty, IFS, or AFT, candidly, we need to collectively step it up. And we really need help on those particular policy issues.
So the Senate loves to set up new committees, so we could set up a legislative affairs committee that would, be staffed with people who would be appropriate for these kinds of things. It would kind of be like an every other year assignment, so it wouldn't be that terrible. But that might be a way to help. Yeah.
Off this topic, but I just had a general question about the Senate. Maybe I should know this or have this information, but as far as the structure and the participants on the Senate, do you all have like a dashboard that would show the representation across like the different schools, the representation of the various demographics, people of color, women, et cetera? Because I'm just wondering, like, would it ever be heavily weighted to, let's say, the business school or journalism? I have no idea, so I'm just asking a question.
So it's proportional by college. So
Okay.
Like CAS is a big college, so they have more senators than
Okay.
business and so
How
forth.
many senators total?
There are about 54 senators. There are 5 students. There are a couple OAs and SEIU staff, but it's mostly, 80-85% faculty. And I'm not going to argue that it's a representative in any true sense. It is elected, and those elections there's more and more interest in those elections. It's a service obligation that people aren't compensated for instance.
How have you, through the election process, tried to make sure because obviously any election process you can have higher demographics of different individuals. How have you guys tried to focus on making sure that there's cross-representation?
So since the senators are elected, there's no effort to try to have quotas or anything like that. When we set up committees, I think we are sensitive to the idea of making sure that we have diverse viewpoints on the committees, and diverse both in the sense of, a lot of senses, like we want people from different colleges, not just education, but from CAS. We want diverse in terms of gender and race, but also diverse in terms of their status at the faculties. Whether are they full professors or they non-tenured track faculty, because those groups will have very different perspectives on things. So you're trying to establish a committee with 6 people on it. There's no way you're going to get every one of those measures, so we try to do the best we can.
I think we're going to have to try to move along, but you have one question.
Okay, I'll just make mine as a quick comment. Sorry. I was going to dovetail on the 2 questions that Chuck brought up about how do we respond to student success in high school and transfer credits, as well as what do we mean by student support and success. I'd love to have a deeper conversation with Senate, both in terms of what we mean by that, by student success, how you are internally dealing with transfer credits, and so that these students that come in from worthy institutions, not just where we're challenging the validity of a high school, but then they have to functionally start over again. But also then, what is the Senate support for the non-faculty kinds of support, such as academic advising, career advising, event shop, and even something like financial, personal finance, how you figure your financial way through school. Because I think one of the things that Chuck and we've talked about is how do we be really unique in terms of how we support students through this journey, whether it's 4 years, 2 years, 8 years, 15 years, whatever. And I think that that's something that we're working on over these next 4 years that we really want to take a very serious non-lip service dive into. And obviously that's a Senate relationship.
So we are going to have Danica come, I think at the moment it's scheduled for April 17th for an hour to the Senate, and I would like to invite any of you who are in town and able to do that to come to that. It'll be sort of a breakout session type meeting and an effort to get us up to speed on some of these issues.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry we have to move along.
Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. President Schill.
Great. So, morning, everyone. Yesterday, Jamie gave us quite a sobering review of the university's budget situation. And while it presents challenges for all of us, it's also something that we will manage our way through without harming all of the progress that we've achieved over the past 4 years. And that, to me, is very important. Now, I'm not going to recover all of the ground that Jamie covered, but bottom line, with a drop of enrollment, especially our international students, and an increase in costs such as PERS, salaries, benefits, and health insurance, we are facing next year a substantial gap in resources. Even if we were to receive $120 million that the university presidents have requested from the legislature in additional PUSF funding, that we estimate that we are going to experience as a university a shortfall of between $10 and $11 million if we were to do nothing. That is unacceptable to me. I think it's unacceptable to you. And it's now evident that we're going to have to act to reduce expenditures over the next 2 years. So today I'm going to be sending out a memo to the campus explaining the current situation and notifying them that Vice President Moffitt, Provost Giant Bonivar, and I will spend the coming weeks seeking additional advice and input from campus constituencies about how to manage the situation. As we reduce our expenditures, we're going to make some hard decisions. But importantly, those decisions need to be based upon our values. Rather than simply cut evenly across the board, we will seek to protect as much as possible the programs and services that are vital to our core academic and research mission and that don't erode our recent progress. In particular, I'm going to propose that certain areas, particularly those having to do with affordability, access, student success, and safety, be spared. We also need to approach these reductions in a humane fashion, recognizing that 79% of our expenditures are labor-related. Now, as you know, we are going to be setting non-resident tuition in this meeting, and we'll set in-state tuition later in the spring in the hope that we'll have a clearer sense of our finances. Enrollment is a very important part of our conversations. Last week, Roger Thompson provided me with an update on our enrollment outlook for next year. As of March 1, interest in the University of Oregon is at a record high, with just under 27,000 applications, a 12% increase over last year. He reports increases in applications from students in Oregon, and moreover, double-digit percentage increases in applications from non-resident students across the country. These increases have been particularly large in areas that we've invested additional recruiting resources, such as Colorado, Arizona, Washington, Texas, and the upper Midwest. Our applicant pool also is stronger academically, and it's more diverse than last year. Now, applications are important, but of course, many of these students will have lots of choices. We need to convince students to choose the University of Oregon by showing them all of the advantages that we have to offer. So we plan on having 40 separate events in Eugene and all over the nation, as well as in some international locations. Indeed, Roger and I are going to do a road trip through Southern California in a couple weeks, where we hope to meet lots of prospective students and their parents, as well as their loved ones. Now, in Salem, our work is ongoing, and as Maria indicated, we are working in tandem with our unions, with our students, most importantly, or collaboratively with our students, to increase our state operating funds this session. The legislature will consider a revenue package that could generate as much as $2 billion to fund public higher education. Fund public education. As Maria indicated, we are working with our students and our unions to make the point that funding K through 12 and undergraduate education is essential for the future of our students and our state, and not or. The co-chairs of the Joint Ways and Means Committee are expected to announce their proposed budget this week, and we will know at that point whether our voices have been heard. Every indication that I've had thus far is that they will not be heard sufficiently loudly. The University of Oregon also has lots of priority bills. As Bill and I discussed, there are lots of legislation that aren't just focused on funding. Some of our other funding bills I'll mention are, we're looking for matching fund for Sustainable City Year program. It's already had a hearing, and in the next few weeks, we'll have additional hearings on other programs, including prison education, the Oregon Research Schools Network, and the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology. Now, the legislature has been focused on other broad safety issues that will have an impact on the University of Oregon, including bills relating to preventing and responding to workplace harassment and sexual assault. And last week we were made aware, and Maria mentioned in her comments, that a bill would be introduced to disarm police departments on both the University of Oregon and PSU's campuses. We are working with legislators, with UOPD, with students and others to address this measure and to ensure that we have every tool in our toolbox to keep our campus and our community safe. I should also mention the 116th Congress is also underway. Suzanne Bonamici, our graduate and a member of the House of Representatives, is now going to be taking on an important role as chair of the subcommittee on Civil Rights and Human Services. That committee has jurisdiction over issues relating to civil rights, including Title IX. We look forward to working with her both to showcase our efforts to combat sexual harassment and also to be part of the national debate and the national effort to deal with the problem of sexual violence on our campuses. Now, related to Title IX, the University of Oregon has joined with other institutions in January in submitting comments on the proposed changes to responding to campus sexual assault. We're also going to be launching our second sexual assault climate survey in April. Now, President Trump is expected to release his budget on March 11th. We're working with the AAU and the APLU to advance student aid and federal research priorities. Unless Congress comes to an agreement to lift budget caps, discretionary spending will be subject to sequestration, or, in other words, an across-the-board cut of 10%. Lastly, I want to come back to campus. I'm really delighted that Bob Goldberg, before that, Bob Goldberg is actually going to be on Capitol Hill, meeting with our Alumni Association, as well as meeting with our delegation to talk about the Knight campus and some of our initiatives here. A few points about campus, and then I'll be done, answer any questions you might have. I want to thank Karen Ford. I don't know if I see Karen in the audience today, but Karen worked hard on conceptualizing a new fellowship program to support faculty in the arts and humanities in their research and creative projects. In funding that program, we're going to provide 12 fellowships a year from the President's Success Fund, which is donor money, and I'm going to be really excited to see what comes out of that. We want to bolster our wonderful humanities and arts faculty and their research. In an era where student enrollments are declining in these fields, we need to send the message that the University of Oregon will always be, in the words of our chair, a comprehensive university that values the humanities, the humanistic social sciences, as well as the arts. Now, Karen does double duty. Actually, Karen probably does triple duty. Did the Honors College last year. She's chairing the CAS task force that Bill mentioned. And I just want to clarify one thing that Bill said. There is no particular proposal that we have put forward. This was really a blue sky effort to sort of look at our current structure, since we had a vacancy in the role of Dean of CAS, and say, what should the university, what should our structure be? And they're looking at it, and I think they're getting into some very interesting conversations. I think probably the most productive conversations are not the ones that are trying to read my mind in terms of what I want, because the whole point was not to state what I want, but because I don't know what I want. But, you know, it's been an interesting process, because Bill quoted from Bill Bowen's book, which is, Bill was a mentor of mine and really devoted to shared governance. But sometimes when you try to share governance and you just sort of say, let's all talk together give us your ideas, you then can find some pushback in the process. And I think that this has been sort of interesting. But I think that we're now in a more stable situation. I'm looking forward to what they have to tell me at the end of the process. What we've done is we've extended the time period before we take any action till next school year. Give us time to absorb. And we may do nothing, or we may put forward a proposal to do something. That will be in the context of talking with every campus constituency, including the Senate, including the students, and it's an important opportunity to think about what we're doing. So yesterday, you heard about our exciting plans for partnering with OHSU in a joint center for biomedical data sciences. That center will join both institutions in research to fight cancer. I just want to say how excited I am about this. I'm going to actually be meeting with their foundation along with Danny Jacobs, president of OHSU, in about, I think, 2 weeks, along with our research seed grant program that has announced, that has funded 10 collaborations between OHSU and University of Oregon faculty. We just announced, I think yesterday morning, another set of seed grant proposals. In addition, we have new degree programs that we're talking about. And basically, this is a wonderful effort to leverage the strengths of both institutions for the betterment of our students, for the betterment of our faculty, and for everyone in the state. And it's something that I'm really delighted to be part of. Lastly, I know as you've walked through campus, many of you have, and I've walked with you, you've seen remnants of last week's 2 snowstorms with branches coming down, with some piles of snow and slush in various places. I just want to express my gratitude, my deep gratitude to the scores of people who worked during the storm and dumped a foot of snow on our campus and then came back for another 6 inches about 2 or 3 days later. These men and women worked through extreme conditions, some for over 30 hours straight, to ensure our students that they would be safe, that they would have food, that they would be warm. They cleared trees. They enabled us to reopen. They removed snow from roadways and walkways, and we were able to reopen after 3 days. It was really a heroic effort. They could have called in sick. They could have said they couldn't get in, but they didn't. They did it because they take pride in doing their jobs well. They care about our students. They care about our entire community. And we all owe them a really big debt of gratitude. And they made me proud to be their president. So those are my comments. Any questions from anybody?
I might just add one thought, if I may. Someone said the trustees should reach out and talk to the faculty and et cetera. I've been known for wandering around the campus talking to faculty and deans and asking strange questions. And it always gives President Schill the crazies because I don't often tell him that I'm out wandering around asking, but it's a great fun and you do learn a lot. So I endorse that. And Mike endorses it on our behalf.
Chuck Lillis Unleashed. Yes, and I think that there is a lot more contact between the trustees and the faculty than we see because a lot of it is unstructured, particularly those who find their way onto campus a lot. So, and I think it's valuable.
Jimmy, you have a comment?
Mike, for the budget cut numbers, are you assuming enrollment growth, enrollment staying flat? Is the number flexible while you wait for that?
So I think actually that we are assuming enrollment growth. At one point we thought enrollment growth was going to provide us with that margin to avoid having to make cuts, or at least make the worst of cuts. But what we found is we are in the last year or two of the sort of, I guess it's the mouse going through the snake of international enrollment. So we had some very, very large cohorts of international students, largely from China, that has reduced way, way down. And so it's not just what comes in next year, but it's every year they're leaving and they're being replaced by smaller number of students. And when we look at that, we're seeing that, on the horizon, international enrollment is down all over the country. Not every school. Some of the schools are experiencing increases, but we are going to have trouble holding our own in international enrollment. So essentially, where we are right now in the first year or two, as that mouse goes through the snake, the increase in Rogers enrollment, which we're hoping for, is going to be matched by the decrease in international students. And then in about a year or two, we're going to be at steady state. So then it will all be growth and additional resources. So that's a long way of saying that next year, really under any positive scenario we can come up with, $120 million, which I think maybe one or two people in this room think is likely. $120 million for all the public universities, which we are saying, and we have said, if we get that, we will recommend to the board tuition increases less than 5%. With that, with Roger hitting his enrollment targets, we're still going to need an additional $10 million of reductions in budget to be able to manage it. Now, it's possible that we could way overshoot enrollment growth, and then that number would come down a bit. But I think that where we are right now is we think prudently we need to be planning for something like $10 or $11 million.
Mike, if you don't get the 120 million, does that number go up?
Potentially it could go up. What will certainly go up is our recommendation to you for in-state tuition. Because, which is, and we would hate to see that, but, it's going to come from two places, right? We're either going to, if we don't, we can't, I don't want to, I'm not going to run the university at a deficit for more than a year. We don't have those reserves to be able to do that, and it's not prudent. So it's either going to come from the students or it's going to come from reductions in staffing. But there's basically, when you're 80% people, it's not clear. I mean, we'll try to do better on purchasing. We'll try to do better on, reducing expenditures that are not people related. But, we've done a lot of that, and we've talked to you a lot about that in the past. I think Jamie will have a report at the next meeting about how we've saved money on purchasing. But at a certain point, those are the places that we have to go.
May I make just a logistical suggestion?
Yeah.
That if the remaining questions for Mike are related to the budget, that we move into the next agenda item, which is tuition, which begins with Jamie's overview of the anticipated cost increases and related items. I don't want to cut this discussion.
That's
but
fine.
Let's see, is there another question for Mike before we move on? Or okay, thank you, Michael. Jamie, so this is an action item for the board. This is tuition and mandatory fees, non-resident undergraduate and selected graduate students as recommended by the colleges.
Great. So Kevin and I jointly co-chaired TFAB this year, and so we're going to jointly give you this presentation about where we are and the recommendations. So pass it to Kevin, who's going to start.
So good morning. I'm pleased to have the opportunity, believe it or not, to talk about non-resident tuition today and the proposal that we are putting in front of you. The proposal is a result of significant work by our TFAB group, a very committed group of individuals who spent countless hours really deliberating every issue possible as we set this rate going forward. I've been involved with TFAB in the past, but this is my first year as a co-chair, and I can attest to the transparency of the process, I can attest to the commitment of the individuals in the room in terms of being highly engaged and really putting quality time into the discussions and deliberations going forward. And I also would like to acknowledge the work that Jamie has done, having done this for some 8 years, and this year especially spending some extra time to try to figure out ways for us to continue to improve the process going forward. And so I think what you're going to get today is the best of work from a group of very, very focused and dedicated people. So I'm having some difficulties with display here.
Just use the down arrow.
Down arrow?
Oh.
Nope.
This is yesterday. Sorry, Kelly.
Okay. So today we want to share a little about the new and improved tuition and fee process, and then share a little bit of background information that will provide some context for you, help you understand what we considered when developing the recommendation. We'll talk a little bit about the cost drivers, we'll talk that impacted our conversations, and then our recommendation that we presented to the president earlier this quarter. We've got a bunch of slides, and so feel free to pose questions or comments at any point during the presentation. I'm happy to entertain. Of course, I will quickly defer to my colleague Jamie for a response. So, tuition fees, which is not TFAB, which is not a four-letter word, stands for Tuition and Fee Advisory Board, which is a volunteer group of about 18 members who come from the faculty, the staff, and student communities here at the university. We've met 9 times between October of 2018 and February, and attendance at the meetings was very good, the level of engagement high, and the discussions and deliberations deep at every one of the meetings. The meetings were open to the public, and we very often had guests, including reporters from the Oregon Daily Emerald. In addition, the ASUO and TFAB co-hosted a student forum back in January, and due to some really good work by our student government leaders, we had 120 people show up to that meeting, which was probably 3 times what we normally see at those kind of forums. The president also hosted a forum once he got the recommendation from the TFAB, with the idea that he would listen to people's reactions to the recommendation that he had been presented, and then subsequently invited people to use an online space to add additional comments before he made his final recommendation, which he's presenting to you today. Some other improvements that we saw this year were an improved website that included both upcoming meetings, information, and the minutes from each meeting so that people could really be informed as to what was happening in this process. And finally, as has been alluded to earlier, you should be aware that we are only talking about non-resident tuition at this presentation today.
And just to be clear, not the resident undergraduate tuition, so we will also deal with fees and graduate tuition.
Go next. So for context, a little bit, this slide here helps help us to understand the projected revenue from tuition for this upcoming year, or for this year, I'm sorry. Of particular note, you can see that the majority of our tuition revenue comes from non-resident undergraduate students. In fact, nearly 58% of the 442,000 tuition revenue projection comes from those students. But when you combine that with the resident undergraduate tuition net revenue, we project that about 78% of our net tuition comes from those undergraduate students. It's important to note, and I think it's been mentioned before, that about 10% of that comes off the top to fund scholarships. Another piece on this slide that would be of interest is that you'll see that graduate students projected about 16% of the tuition revenue. But but if you'll note at the bottom where it says G tuition, about 23 million, almost a third of that, goes back to pay for graduate education tuition. This slide talks a little bit about our fee revenue estimates, and as you can see, the vast majority of it comes from our auxiliaries, with housing providing about half of the $138 million we expect to collect. As a point of reference here, you might note that the I fee, which is set by ASU, may seem a little high, but you should know that they fund a number of student-facing programs and a significant number of our student organizations here on campus. And then this slide is just an indication of where we have been for the last 12 years or so as it relates to tuition and mandatory fees. It shows you actual dollars and then CPI adjustments over that period of time.
Great. So as Kevin said, we did spend a lot of time with TFAB, and particularly in the fall, trying to get everybody up to speed on all of the data and background information. One of the things that we did look at very closely on both the resident and non-resident side was how does our tuition compare to other institutions. This is the slide that shows where we are in terms of, I just want to emphasize, gross tuition, meaning before scholarships, against those other peers. This slide shows the resident rate, and you can see that we are close to the average, but I think we're about $700, if I'm looking at that right, 11, 8, 12, yeah, $700 below some of the other schools on the resident rate in terms of tuition. Again, these are gross tuition dollars because we don't have necessarily that level of data on net tuition. We are aware, though, that a lot of other schools are in a position to give out more scholarships than we are, which means those net numbers are probably even higher. This slide you've seen before, but I'm always going to put it up there because it really does affect our dynamics, particularly with our rate of resident tuition. So what it's saying is what level of state appropriation are we getting per student FTE among those AAU publics. I will note there are actually two schools below us this year. There's University of Colorado, which is always around where we are in terms of these funding levels. And then I have joked at certain presentations that Illinois is actually the other school, and I believe that's because this was the year their state was in budget crisis and literally did not distribute funds to the university. So I don't think they're normally at that level. I think that's just a one-year anomaly in terms of some cash flow issues. But you can see when you look at all of the students, we're sitting at $28.58, and the average for our peers is over $9,000. We did this year do an additional analysis, which we haven't done in the past, which took a little bit more work because it's not in the IPEDS data, but we collected information about resident student levels so that we could look at these numbers not just on a per student basis, but a per resident student basis. And so the chart that you're seeing there, which has the same pattern but different dollars, is showing you what is UO's dollars per resident student, which is sitting at $59.91, versus the average, again, for these AAU publics, which is over $14,000. So we're still looking at a situation where our state funding per student compared to these other institutions is much, much lower. It's actually amazing to me, if you think about it, that our resident tuition on a gross basis is under the average, given how much lower our state support is.
Jamie, could I just add
Yeah.
an additional analysis that Jamie and others have done that presents a more complete picture of this is if you take the state support per undergraduate and you add in the tuition, and then if you add in endowment dollars available per undergraduate, and you look at some schools who have actually much higher tuition than we do, also have much larger endowments, so they can produce thousands of dollars more per year per undergraduate than we can. And so when you look at a cash flow comparison, the battle that Maria and her colleagues and Kevin and Jamie and others take on about setting tuition, it's in the face of a pretty serious deficit condition. Sorry for the interruption, Jamie.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just think this is a very important slide because it helps explain part of why our budget is so challenged. Getting back to comparative data, TFAB did spend quite a bit of time talking about this next slide, which is where is our non-resident tuition rates? Where are those, again, for undergraduates, where are those placed versus the AU publics? And this is a slide we've shown you data for the last several years, and so you have a sense of we are sitting right at market, meaning that we're right at that average. Again, these are gross tuition levels, so we are dealing with a situation where other schools, again, have from what we can tell, much bigger scholarship budgets, so it's challenging. So when we think about non-resident tuition, and one of the points that was discussed was a concern of, we obviously are in a very tight budget situation, but if you increase non-resident tuition too much, you could actually see a situation where that leads to less non-resident tuition revenue overall if students choose to go to other schools. And so being very careful, particularly given the placement of where our school is in the market in terms of these other schools. And so that's something that we've been looking at very carefully. Other data that I think is relevant to the conversation, we every year we try to track what our staffing levels are compared to our peer group. This is a slide you've seen, although the numbers are changing each year as we update it with more information. Basically, when we look at our, this is, again, the AU Publics, when we look at our teaching faculty to student ratio, we're sitting at about 78% of peer institutions. I will note, I believe this ratio has gotten slightly better in the last couple of years, but not much. It's always been a pretty low ratio, and so we do not have the same teaching faculty ratio. When we pull the same numbers and look at non-teaching staff, what we're looking at is even leaner. It's basically 60% of the public AU average is where we're sitting today, and you can see the different schools and what they have recorded. Okay, so I'm going to turn and get into more of the ENG fund context and the budget issues that we've been talking about. And I know, hopefully this is building on the information that we've been talking about with the board every quarter about our budget and what's going on with the ENG fund. Just again, for some background context, the ENG fund budget this year is around $541 million. Our numbers have shifted very, very slightly. That used to be 80% funded with tuition, 80% invested in people. I looked at them the other day as I was updating the slide and realized, oh, we're at 79. So it's not very different, same trend, but you'll see on your slides from yesterday that we're actually about 79% tuition revenue, 79% directly invested in people, and that does fund the majority of activities in the schools and colleges and the administrative units. Just as a reminder for context, when the board was actually first starting up, we did have a deficit situation that we had to deal with. We had about a $10 million deficit. Through a combination of state investments, cost-cutting, and tuition increases, we managed to be relatively balanced in years 16, 17, and 18, meaning we're bringing in enough revenue to cover our expenses. This year, unfortunately, and we talked about this more in depth yesterday, our best estimate at this time is about a $7.9 million deficit in the ENG fund. And the challenge around that, and we did talk about this in TFAB, although I will say at the time that TFAB was meeting, we were still dealing with the $5.6 million figure, although I was trying to give them signals that it was likely going up because we were diving into the analysis and it looked like it was going up. But the challenge is that, as the president said, we cannot run a deficit year over year. We have to figure out through some combination of revenue and cuts, how do we address that situation? And so as we look at next year, it's not only about what new costs are coming on board, it's also about what is our existing situation that we're rolling into the year actually facing. Okay, so the cost drivers, we reviewed this information in the December board meeting, so hopefully there's nothing on here that's very surprising to the board. I will highlight that one figure did change. We have slightly taken down our estimate on retirement costs after looking at that in a lot more detail. We were at 7.6. We're now estimating, the budget office is estimating it's around 7.1. Which is fairly consistent with what happened the last time that PERS increased their costs. But we are looking still at $23.6 million of new costs, and just to emphasize for everybody in the room, this is not every single cost that's going to go up. This does not capture individual department initiatives. It doesn't capture other things that we may recognize we absolutely have to do regarding new positions. This is mainly focused around things we know are absolutely going to happen related to salary contracts and PEB costs and retirement costs and those types of things. But it does give you a rundown on a dollar basis of what we are looking at. The next slide, again, we looked at in December, but it has revised slightly with the adjusted PERS rates. This gives you a sense of what are those estimates on a percentage basis. And so as I speak with different groups, usually what I try to point out to them is, with the exception of retirement costs, we are not looking at anything that's really large on a percentage basis. Some of these are really big numbers because we're working off of big bases. But that retirement cost at 13% for us is a really large number. And overall, the adjusted number, again, for just these cost drivers is running at about 4.36% of the E&G fund budget. Okay. A final slide on cost drivers. This relates to PERS. Again, slightly updated figures. I think it's fair to say, and I've said this in previous meetings, I mean, we had the increase in 18 that ended up being over 10 million for the institution as a whole, over 7 million on the E&G fund. We're anticipating something of a similar magnitude for fiscal year 20 next year. We will then get a break for a year. We definitely will have another year where this will go up. I'm not convinced we're not going to have another year. I have to be honest after that in 24, given everything I'm reading about PERS, but I'm certainly not a PERS expert, and I'm not going to pretend to be able to predict. I try to use this slide to help people understand these are cumulative, because I don't know that everybody who sees these numbers really at first takes that in. So as I know you guys are aware, because we've talked about it quite a bit, the PERS increases simply increase our expense base. And so after fiscal year 18, our retirement costs went up by over 10 million for the institution. They stayed at that higher level. We're anticipating them going up another 10 million in 20, so they'll then be $20 million higher than they were 3 years previously, and then another 10 million. So just an incredible cumulative impact. And the thing I try to share with groups so they have some sense of scale is $30 million is a lot bigger than many of the budgets for entire schools and colleges at this institution. It's like we created a new school and college of retirement, basically, that we're adding from a cost perspective over this time period. And at the bottom, the caveat I always put in here is that currently, under the current estimates, the unfunded status of PERS was, the funded status, how much of the liabilities are funded, was above 70%, which meant this collar was in effect that restricts how much they can increase our rates in a given year. If we were to see significant changes in how they're doing the projections, or if the market were to decline significantly, we could see that funded status drop below 70%, in which case then we could see significantly larger increases from the PERS board, because based on their own operating procedures, they'd be able to push through charges that were much larger. So caveat on the bottom is these numbers could go up significantly if we end up in a situation where the actuarial report is showing that there's a bigger problem in terms of the funded status of PERS. Okay, so when you summarize the 2020 budget challenge, and I will have another slide at the end that I think will help make this hopefully even clearer for you. The challenge that we have really is that we are starting with a deficit of 7.9. We are adding on cost drivers that represent 23.6 million. And at least the version of the state budget that came out in the governor's recommended budget, which was flat funding, really represented a cut for us next year because of the way flat funding is distributed, that 49% of it is distributed year one and 51% is distributed year two. And so if we're flat funded as an institution, we'd actually go from a year when we had 51% down to 49, and that's what's causing this cut. So if you add that all together, there is a $34 million gap that we need to think about filling next year, again, through some combination of new revenue coming into the institution and reducing expenditures. We have been talking, and we talked quite a bit in TFAB about two opportunities that exist to significantly fill this gap. The first one is campus growth, and the caveat I'll have here is the one the President mentioned, which is we have really positive indications about our efforts about bringing more students to campus. However, we are still in the middle of this decline of international students, and we are projecting that next year we will continue to see the decline in the overall population as some of those larger classes leave and are replaced by much, much smaller classes. And so one of the challenges and one of the things I'll be talking about with TFAB on Friday, because we've now gotten more refined kind of projections, is that while the campus growth is an opportunity, it is likely that a very large part of it will be offset by other issues with the demographics of what's going on campus with other student groups. The other opportunity is increased state support.
Question? Is
Yeah.
international tuition a lot higher? Is that part of the issue?
No, so international tuition is actually equivalent to non-resident tuition, but it's given, relative to domestic resident tuition, it's a non-resident rate domestically. There is an international fee in addition that is charged to international students that supports some specific services for them. But really, the main issue is that I'd say over the last 3 years, we've probably dropped close to 1,000 international students, and those were all students paying non-resident tuition rates.
Great, thank you.
And I should have said, please interrupt me. I tend to keep going when people don't interrupt. On the state support side, there's a huge opportunity there, and one that I think lots of us are trying to work with. I actually went back and looked at the numbers more discreetly last week. There is actually a $10.7 million swing. I've been saying 10 million, just rounding it, but it's really $10.7 million between what the HEC model is saying we will receive under the governor's recommended budget versus that full $120 million PUSF budget. So there's a very, when you look at that $34 million kind of gap, that's based on the GRB, the governor's recommended budget. That could reduce significantly if we were to see that $120 million investment budget that the governor put forth come through. So really big impact if we can get those funding. So there are opportunities here that could help us. However, as we've gotten deeper and deeper into these numbers, as the president said earlier, it's become really clear that even when we look at the home run scenarios and say, what if we get all the campus growth, and what if we get the full 120 million, because of the trends with the international students, because of the existing deficit growing, we still have a gap. There's no question about it. And again, I'll show you some more numbers a little further in. So we're going to turn to the actual tuition and fee recommendations next, and then at the end I'll have a summary slide that will show you kind of hopefully put more of the numbers into context. On the tuition side, just to remind folks, on the resident side, we will be coming forward with a recommendation in May. Hopefully, TFAB has meetings that are being scheduled for March, April, and May. By that time, we hope to have a much better picture, hopefully, of what's happening with state appropriation. We also hope to have better information related to next year's enrollment because of deposits coming in May. So TFAB is scheduled to really focus on those issues once we hopefully have more information, and we will be coming forward in the May meeting with a recommendation for the board. On the non-resident tuition side, the recommendation is for a 2.97 increase. You might be asking, that's an odd number. We try to keep the increases to whole dollars because we have found in the past that when you bill students for dollars and cents and they forget to pay the cents and then you follow up, they get upset and it causes billing issues and you're spending tons of time going back and forth tracking down pennies, which is ridiculous. So that's just the reason it's that number is because that was the closest whole dollar to where the committee was targeting. That equates to a $22 per student credit hour increase, and for a full-time student, that is a $990 increase that would take tuition to $34,335. Based on our best estimate with steady enrollment assumptions, that would generate roughly $7.4 million of incremental revenue. That takes two things into consideration when we do that calculation. We are assuming some summer revenue because there's a relationship between the number of students on campus, tuition rates, and summer rates, and also that we are setting aside, we have a practice, Maria mentioned this earlier, we have a practice of setting aside 10% of all new tuition revenue to fund scholarships. So that's built into those numbers. Okay. On the graduate side, just so folks know, and I know this is familiar to the board, but on the undergraduate side, we really have one base undergraduate tuition for residents and for non-residents. On the graduate side, we have over 50 different rates, and that's because within each graduate program and within each market, they're looking at the costs that are very specific to delivering that education, and they're also looking at the markets that they serve and what's going on with pricing in those markets. We did review all of those proposed rates. You have a summary of this in your docket, so you have all the materials. With the exception of two schools that I will talk about in a little more detail, the increases range from 0 to 5.4%. And most of the materials, I could say almost all of the materials for the schools where there were the larger increases were focused on the cost drivers and PERS and labor contracts and the cost of the program. I did want to highlight a couple of things related to the programs that had higher increases than 5.4 so that you'd have that information. The College of Design had a few programs that had no increase in their non-resident rates, but they did have higher increases in some of their resident rates. I think the important thing to understand for these programs specifically was the ones where they had the high increase at 15%. Those are all programs where, first of all, they're trying to bring the tuition in line with the actual cost of the program to make sure that we're appropriately charging for what we're delivering. But those are programs where they effectively have tuition guarantees in place through scholarships today. And so no current students would see these increases. These increases would only be for new students who choose to come to the program under that pricing. So I think that's an important factor to understand. They had another program under Planning, Public Policy, and Management, which is not under a guarantee program, where it was an 8% increase. And that was a combination of the normal cost drivers they're trying to cover, and then there was a feeling that they'd cut back too far on administrative support, particularly faculty support, and so part of this proposal involved funding a faculty support person for the program that the faculty felt was needed, faculty and administration felt was needed. And then finally, the sports product design program is a 7.1% increase. That is both to cover regular increases, and then they're actually looking to initiate a tuition guarantee program for that. And again, the way they do that with these graduate programs is through scholarships, where students come in at one level of tuition, and then as tuition increases, they get scholarships. If they're a current student, they don't pay that increase, that's scholarshiped back. So it's a pretty manual process, but it effectively locks in tuition for students for these programs. The other program that had a larger increase was the School of Law. They're proposing a 7% increase on resident and non-resident students for for those three programs. Really a combination of factors behind this one. First was just the normal cost drivers. They also needed some funding for certain things they've been doing around career development services. And then finally, I will say the law school has been in a very challenging budget situation for the last several years, because in particular, the law market a number of years really reduced in terms of the number of applicants, and they'd had to reduce the number of students in that school to keep up their quality measures. And so that's a budget that has had challenges, I think is a fair way to put it. And so this would help them to hopefully start to address, be part of starting to address those challenges. They have also done, they talked, when they came to TFAB and talked, they also shared that they've done a lot of research to look at tuition rates of other law schools in the state and other places, and they feel like this still positions them very competitively. It's actually, apparently will be a lower rate than their comparator group. I'm going to turn to Kevin on the mandatory fees.
Can I ask a quick question before we talk about fees? So do students understand, is there sort of an explicit conversation, or I don't know if this is a Rogers Shop question or financial aid question, but do students understand that chances are when they come here, what they pay in year one will not be what they pay in year 4, assuming they graduate 4 years?
Yeah, so we actually had some really good discussion about this in TFAB, and the feeling is that many students don't understand that, and that we need to figure out ways to be more transparent about that, because when you get in a room and you start talking to people and you explain, hey, there are cost drivers, costs are going up, inflation goes up for everything, things become more expensive over time, people get that. But I think it was pretty clear to me from the discussion that we had, particularly with our student members of TFAB, that they feel like many students walk on the campus, they see a rate, and they're assuming that rate is going to stay the same for 4 years. And even though in many, many universities across the country, we're not unusual that rate is subject to inflation and costs, people do not walk in necessarily thinking that. And I think you could tell from some of the comments that we got from students that they, even though on a percentage basis, these are not the largest percentage increases we've seen, they're hard if they're unexpected, and that we're not doing as good of a job as we could be doing to make sure that people are aware of that.
Yeah.
Again, I don't think there are some schools that have guaranteed tuition. We've looked at that in the past. we could look at that again. I think majority of schools don't have guaranteed tuition, so this is a reality across the country. But I do think, and Kevin can chime in, I do think a lot of students, the feedback we got is it's not as clear as it could be.
We don't have guaranteed state funding.
No, we do not. That is absolutely true. So. Any other questions before we keep rolling? Yeah.
I just have a quick question. So it seems like from the forums that 2.97 non-resident was about the lowest we were going to go. Like that was, am I just correct in thinking that?
I can tell you that in TFAB, we looked at a whole range of outcomes, and we certainly looked at tuition rates that would have been higher and seriously discussed them. And there was definitely concern, and I think the student members of TFAB did a really good job of saying they felt like when we started to get into those higher ranges that we were looking at rates that they felt would put a real burden and be very challenging for students. And so in the notes, we kind of tried to capture all the scenarios we looked at, but we spent a lot of time looking at slightly higher rates or higher rates than these as well. But, the feeling was we were trying to balance both the challenges that we have, the challenges that students have in terms of covering this, as well as the market conditions as well. But we did look at, seriously talk about, particularly in the last meeting, rates that were higher than this.
Yeah, no, so I understand that. And so I was kind of glad to hear, I talked to Amani this past weekend, and then hearing Maria say it again, that this is a number that they felt like they could live with, especially, that seems like a consensus from students on the TFAB board. I guess that's redundant, but I guess, is there any way to assure that this isn't going to just balloon the cost of the resident tuition? Because I mean, that's a big concern of mine as well. Is that, I mean, there's going to be a big trade-off, and I want some assurance as well that it's not going to just make the other one be 10%.
Right question.
Yeah, so we had, I can start, and Kevin, I mean, we had a lot of discussion about that issue because obviously there are not, there are limited numbers of ways that we can deal with these budget gaps. And so there absolutely was discussion both about the burden that this puts on non-resident students, about questions about, fairness between different groups and how much is being put on resident students. What I will tell you, and I do think this certainly, at least for me, impacts my thinking is, after talking to Roger and the group that's working on enrollment, I'm not convinced, even if, let's say, your goal were to try to reduce the resident piece, I'm not convinced that raising the non-resident by more than 2.97 is going to help with that, because I think you start to really raise those risks of, how much are other schools going to raise tuition, where are we placed competitively. I can share with you last year, we ran AAU numbers. I think last year the average increase across AAUs was about 2.5. So I totally
non-resident?
For non-resident, yeah. The year before that, it might have been, I don't remember off the top of my head, so I probably shouldn't quote. But it's over time. I think. Do you remember what that average was? It was between 3 and 3.5, something like that. But there are real discussions about both the question about how do you think about this with residents and non-residents, but also, you may just shoot yourself in the foot by going too high on the non-resident side as well. So
a resident is definitely below average by now, but I mean, if we put ourselves in a position where we have to raise it by 8 to 10% or whatever it's going to be, I don't want to put a number out there, but we're not going to be for long, and then we're going to just be going back and forth between the two.
So to kind of address your first question about the floor, when we started, one of the things we had as a tool to use this year was a tuition calculator. And it included everything from resident to non-resident to cost drivers and the like. So we started with zeros in those columns, and then we're able to adjust numbers accordingly. So when we landed on 2.97, it was in conjunction with what resident tuition could be to address the deficit. And the number, to completely address the deficit, the number would have to be crazy. But we are at least took those things into consideration when we landed at 2.97%.
I think one of the challenges, just to clarify too, is we have so many uncertain things still that it's hard. You have to, and that's why we kind of tried to lay out lots of different scenarios in the discussion, because we don't know what state appropriation is going to actually be. We don't actually know whether we're going to be successful with the growth initiative. We've made estimates, I'll show you, of the impact of the international students, but we don't really know till that happens. So what we did is we tried to run a lot of different scenarios with the group and talk about, if X happens and Y happens, how big of a gap. Or we don't know. At the time, we didn't know what level of cost-cutting, budget reductions we'd be doing. So there's a lot of unknown factors. But I can tell you that we spent hours and hours trying to look at different scenarios of what it might be. But your concern that you're expressing was absolutely one that the group discussed and that we talked about.
I think Connie had a question as well.
The part of me that wants to set my expectations wants to ask you an unfair question, which is, what is the number that in-state residents' tuition would need to be increased if we got a flat rate this year out of the legislature to minimize the gap? I mean, I know you know what that is, and I'm not saying we're going there, but just,
Yep.
we know what it is. So
Yeah, it might be easier, actually, if you could, do you mind holding that question
I
until
will
we get
hold
to
it.
the last slide? Because I
Yes.
think the last slide will help actually me to kind of
Okay.
get these numbers in my head. I mean, what I can tell you, just to kind of put some numbers in your head, is the GRB gave us negative 2.7 million. The governor's recommended budget, gave us, that would have cut it by negative 2.7. The last time I ran the numbers from the HEC on what would the U of O get with 120 million, it was positive 8. So there was a $10.7 million swing. And then what I can also share with you is each 1% increase in resident tuition generates about $750K. So when you think about, I mean, that 10.7 million represents a ton. If you said that all came out of resident tuition, which we did not necessarily say, that represents a huge swing in terms of where we are. So hopefully that helps a little, and then hopefully the last slide will help pull that together.
Do we have any analysis around the elasticity of demand?
We have not
We don't.
not good analysis, I guess I would say. Yeah, we have a lot of analysis that's done in Rogers Shop around their estimates of pricing and scholarship levels and what they've seen in the past and trying to predict at different scholarship levels and tuition levels, but we don't have a great sense of what that slope looks like. And that's part of what we're trying to be cautious about. And I would say the other piece, again, just to be really clear, we have detailed information about other schools and what they're charging for gross tuition. We only have, kind of word of mouth information about their scholarship budgets and how they're, we have surveys of students and what scholarships they got offered from other schools that give us a sense. We know from networks what other people, when you share with colleagues. But we don't have great information that gives us the absolute net price compared to the net price of other schools. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it to tuition, knowing that I owe you an answer, Patty, on your question. Or to fees, sorry.
Fees, yeah. So the other thing we had to consider was mandatory fee increases. And as you'll see on the chart, those overall increased by 6.9%. Yeah. But that does not include every fee that we have. Some fees did not increase this year. You can see the ones that were not, people that were not asking for increases. But we had 4 that did, and of those 4, 2 of them are auxiliaries. The rec center fee is increasing by $2, which is about a 3.2% increase, and the EMU fee is increasing $3, which is about a 4.5% increase. It should be noted that both of these entities did not ask for increases in the past year, so we're trying to hold the line as much as possible. The incidental fee, which is again set by ASUO, is increased by $8.75, which is about a 3.5% increase. And then the large fee increase that was requested this year is by the health center of $35.25, which is just about an 18% increase. Much of that has to do with the increased demand for services, particularly around mental health on campus, some increased services in the areas of prevention and women's access to health services, and then for detection of outbreak response. We've had a couple of outbreaks over the last couple of years, and so some additional resources being provided in anticipation of things happening in the health world, and then also to align the health center staffing going forward. It should be noted that both the health center and the counseling centers have advisory boards, student advisory boards, and both of those groups endorsed the increase going forward this year. So again, one of those opportunities for us to make sure that we are talking with students and having them involved in the process when we ask them to put up more dollars to support services on campus.
So I'll do the final slide and then hopefully have a better sense of the numbers. So again, just to kind of reiterate, the
Jamie,
ENG
before you
Yep.
go into the fees, the fee increases on a dollar basis are about the same for resident and non-resident.
identical, yeah.
And if we look at gross fees relative to gross tuition, for, I know you don't know the number for residents, but if you look back, is our ratio about what we'd see at similar AAUs?
You know, at the top of my head, I can't answer that. I don't know if JP is in the audience anywhere. I don't see JP. I'd have to get back to you on
okay.
that. I've looked at data in the past, but
Well,
off
I'd be
the top of my
interested
head.
when you get
Yeah.
a chance. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Any other questions I can't answer before?
That's so unlike you.
I know. Well, those are numbers I've looked at, but I haven't looked at them in a while, and so I'm hesitant in public while being probably live streamed to quote you numbers that might not be accurate. So I will get you accurate numbers.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so when you look at this overall, as we said before, just to reiterate, we've got a $7.9 million deficit this year. We've got cost drivers at 23.6. The GRB, which again, we're hopeful that's not where we're going to end up, but the GRB would cut our budget by 2.7, and that would cause the total gap to be about 34.2 million. There are a number of different actions or things that could happen that would help to cover these costs. First of all, what the proposal on the undergraduate non-resident tuition increase would generate about 7.4 million. The increased state funding I talked about could generate up to 10.7 million to help fill that gap. The potential new revenue from campus growth, we were estimating it at around 7.5 million that could come in. Now, the new thing that I've put in here is I do think it's most likely that we're probably going to lose a couple hundred international students, and that's going to wash out a lot of this growth. We are still refining those numbers, but the challenge is that even if we get that growth, at least next year in particular, we're not going to see a net positive impact, and that's part of why the president's moving forward with some budget reductions now. We do have undergraduate resident tuition increase, which will likely add some funding here as well, and then other initiatives like budget reductions. And the best way, Connie, I can answer your question is when we did, I don't know if you remember, but when we did, there was a grid we shared in December in previous board meetings where we looked at different permutations of tuition and said how much would that generate. And roughly speaking, if we keep the resident, if we go with the 2.97 rate and we keep the resident tuition under 5%, then that probably means the undergraduate tuition is generating about 11 million in total. Okay. On top of that, the president just announced budget reductions in the $10 to $11 million range, so that would help with this gap. And then it is true that we do generally see a little bit of an increase in other revenue streams to the ENG fund. So we might see, F&A return go up a little bit. We might see interest income go up a little bit. Graduate tuition, I will tell you, and we talked about this in TFAB, it's really hard to predict because it's affected more by enrollment patterns in different programs necessarily than tuition rates. And so we've had some years where we increase graduate tuition and actually the total tuition revenue is flat. And we've had some years where we increase graduate tuition and it's actually gone down because certain programs didn't have big enrollment. So I think it's likely we could see a little bit of gain there, but it's hard to count on that because you don't know year to year. And what that leaves you with then is really this essentially just broad-based numbers. It leaves you with the $10, $11 million gap that the state could come in and fill, and then we'd be in a reasonable position. Or if the state doesn't come in and fill, then the question is, how are we filling that? What combination of cuts and tuition increases are we looking at to fill that? It is also possible, and the president alluded to this, that maybe Roger's team hits it out of the park, and it's actually not only does he achieve the growth we want, but he achieves more than that, and that helps us on a positive side. We'll have more info on that in May. But there's no question that these are daunting numbers, and that's part of why the president's moving forward with some budget reductions now, because we've gotten to a point where it's clear that even if things go really, really well, there's a gap there that we're going to have to figure out how to fill. So hopefully that helps, and if not, I'm happy to go into more detail
that's good.
later. But it is definitely a challenging situation. Just that.
Any other questions for Jimmy?
Jamie, I have a question about two questions actually about the strategic investments. So I'm wondering if you could give more clarity on how the Strategic Budget Committee is formed and how they process the requests and how they make their decisions. And then going forward, I'm hoping that you can commit to making a website or making this information more public. It's something that I get asked about a lot, actually, and I haven't been able to find good information online.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. And so basically, the Strategic Investment Committee is a group that's formed by the provost as an advisory group. And some years, I think we've done a better job on the provost website of putting up information about who's on it and the process and the outcome of what we're doing. I think it's totally possible that this past year was not one of those. So if you didn't find the information, I apologize. But basically, what we do is we set up a committee of students, faculty, staff. And usually there's about 20 people on the committee. We try to make sure that we have representation from all types of staff as well as faculty. And then Maria, usually, I don't know if she's still here, she's getting me recommendations, for some students. And that group gets formed. And then what happens is we basically put out a request that goes out to deans and vice presidents where we ask them within their portfolios to put forward any initiatives. And we ask it at the dean's vice president level because we want them to prioritize stuff within their portfolios. The first year we did this, we just put it out to campus, and we got so many requests, and they hadn't been prioritized by anyone who understood those areas, and that made it much more challenging for the group. So we basically put out these requests. We have each dean and vice president, we ask them to prioritize their requests. It's generally for one of two types of things, either strategic investments in areas that we want to grow, or often, honestly, just critical investments, like we need a lab safety officer because our ratios aren't very good and we're worried about lab safety, or we need one year we invested in the 911, the communication system for the police. I mean, there's certain things that are more, I wouldn't call them so much strategic as critical. Basically, all those proposals go forward to the committee. It is an advisory group to the provost. The committee meets. Typically, anything, we try to involve expertise where we can. So anything that has a technical component, IS component, we send over to IS and the chief information officer so that they can look and say, often people would underestimate the cost. They might say, I want this system, but they didn't realize it has to integrate with Banner, and that has a lot of cost. So we try to get those costs. We also send the proposals over. We have an enterprise risk management committee that meets every month on the risks facing the university. You all have, Andre's given you reports. Anything with a risk component, we send it over to that committee and ask them to prioritize it. And then it comes back to that group, and that group meets and then sends to the provost prioritized, literally ranked, usually recommendations of the top things that committee feels should be funded. The provost, working with the president, has the authority to decide what that final list is, and it often looks very close to what the committee recommends. But the committee is advisory to the group. Does that answer your question? Is that helpful? So it is it's a pretty intense process, and I will say that almost every year we probably get 4 times as many proposals as we could possibly fund, and many of them often fall in the category of that feels like an absolutely critical thing that we just have to do, which can be very, very challenging. This year we've already pre-spent, just to be clear, a lot of the money in that budget because, for instance, if you recall last year when we did the Honors College differential, we actually took half of it out of last year's Strategic Initiative Fund and half of it we pre-spent out of this year. So there's some points also where things get, the president and provost make a decision to pre-spend.
That kind of negates my question, which is, I mean, I understand it is critical strategic investments, but I mean, with the amount of costs we are facing this year, this seems like a year where it would be like, there's something critical to invest in would be scholarships or, I mean, even recruitment and retention of international students. And I understand that we pre-spent a portion of that money, but I mean, it's kind of a tough question, but how critical really is it?
I would say I'm trying to think of what I can share and what I shouldn't share. I mean, I'll share with you, for example, one of the biggest proposals we got this year was the cybersecurity stuff that I think it was shared with you guys about some of the issues and concerns that we have and investments we need to make. There's a number of different, I think, investments that are critical. We did actually back up the process this year, so normally we make these decisions earlier in the year, but this year the committee is actually going to be meeting in March and April and making recommendations to the provost at the end of April so that we have time in May to see what things are looking like with projections and other things, and then the provost working with the president can decide kind of what's being proposed and how does that stack up with the other things that we're seeing and other issues.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Will?
Yeah, I have another one. And this is a really tough question, and it's probably going to paint a big target on my back. People are probably going to hate me for it. But I've received this question from quite a few students. And I did some background research on it recently. So I read that one of our AAU peers, pretty comparable, University of Iowa, last year put a freeze on just to preface it, they're far below the national average in their resident and non-resident tuition. But last year they put a freeze on their faculty and staff salaries. And I look at our budget and I see that a third of those costs are coming in. I know we are 80% people, but what would it look like? And is there even a possibility that we could minimize those costs or potentially even put a freeze? And I'm sorry, I mean, I don't want to devalue the...
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair question, and actually it's a question that we got from a lot of students, so people know when we did the student forums, there are definitely questions that people ask about salaries and about pay increases. I think the challenge that we have on that front is just that we are contractually obligated. We have 5 labor unions on campus, and even if the president decided I'd like to freeze salaries because that seems like a good way to deal with that, he actually does not have the ability independently to make that decision because we have labor contracts that extend out in some cases for multiple years, and in some cases we're just negotiating labor contracts. And so any decision for any of our represented groups would have to be negotiated with those unions that are representing those employees. So that makes it more challenging, and we do have our faculty are all represented, about half of our staff is represented, and our graduate employees are represented. So it really limits what we can do without a joint negotiation and agreement by those union groups, and it looks like the president wants to add something.
Yeah, I mean, because I've been at some of those universities that have had that happen. We're in a different position. For good or bad, we have a faculty union, and so the only group that's not represented on our campus is the OAs, who are, a significant group on campus, but certainly don't. Pardon me?
What does that stand for?
OAs, officers of administration, so all staff members who are not classified workers. So everyone so the vice presidents are, but then it goes all the way down to people who are doing sort of grant management, to doing office work sometimes. Just depends on whether you're categorized as classified or unclassified. And what we have tended to do in the past is treat the OAs, or the officers of administration, the same way we treat the represented groups, just because we think that's fair. And sometimes the incomes of those people are lower than the representative groups, in fact, often. We do have a choice. At many universities, you would do a freeze, right? That's what happened in 2008. It happened here for a number of years. But we end up with, if we need to reduce labor costs, we typically don't have that in our, arsenal of weapons, and so we end up having to actually separate people, and so it's sort of a bit more draconian than doing that. Now, there's always the opportunity, of course, which I'm not suggesting because I don't want to see all sorts of concern about this. There's always an opportunity to meet with the labor unions and discuss a freeze or something like that. That's a very difficult thing for the unions to do, and it's probably impossible for the classified unions since they're negotiate across all of the campuses. So so we are looking, when we look at reducing labor costs, we're looking typically not renewing people, which is one of the reasons why we need to be very sensitive as we move forward with this process, because what's going to happen is there's going to be some level, after my note goes out this afternoon, of being uncertain and of people being insecure. And we don't want that to be the case. No one wants that to be the case. But I'm not sure there's another option out there. So over the next week or two, Giant and I and Jamie are going to be meeting with various constituency groups, including labor unions and including students, faculty, Senate, and then we will come up with some guidelines in about a week or two, we think. And then, now, one thing that I think is important, though this is veering off from tuition to my previous subject, which Angela shorted me on, and that is that a lot of these budget reductions will not take effect next year, because sometimes you have to do them over 2 years. We may be too late in the year to be able to make some of these budget reductions because contracts are already renewing for next year. So these may get phased in over a period of 2 years.
Well, that's kind of what my line of thinking was too, which is that it feels like people would rather see their salaries freeze than the prospect of not being renewed. But I mean, I guess that's kind of naive thinking from mine. But
Are there other questions, Jimmy?
Mine's a quick one. Jamie, and the cost drivers for the minimum wage increase, is that just limited to student employees, or do we have more groups that are impacted by that?
I believe at this point it's almost entirely student employees, is my understanding. I haven't looked at the detailed numbers in a while. I do think we're going to see it start to hit some of the classified staff as we get into future years when the growth keeps coming up, but I believe that almost all of that is student at this point.
Anything else? I think we might note that this is a national phenomena of governments reducing significantly how much they pay into education, both at the state and federal level. Many of us went to school when state or federal governments provided a much higher percentage of the cost to a student. And it's kind of a national trend for a variety of reasons that the student now will pay for their education. And that's just, I don't see any change in that. I think it's going to present serious financial challenges for a lot of universities that a few years down the road they're going to be in very difficult straits. Okay, no other questions for Jamie or Kevin? No other? Okay. You have a resolution in your book, and just by way of reminder, we're talking about the non-resident undergraduate fee, tuition and fee increase. And we all understand that, I think Will's question, or actually I guess Connie's was very appropriate. We all understand that we're going to come back and consider the resident undergraduate tuition increase in May. And in Oregon, we have, in addition to this philosophy of the students going to pay for their education, we've decided the student's going to pay for PERS too, which is a really unusual situation. So, if there are no other questions, do we have a motion to approve the resolution? It is in the material you got. It references two attachments, A and B, where the details of both the fee increases and the administration of those.
I'll move it.
There's a motion.
Second.
There's a second. Any other comments? Okay, I think we'll take a roll call vote, if we might, Angela.
I'll go alphabetically.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry. Marcia?
Yes.
Connie Ballmer?
Approve?
Peter Bragdon is Absent. Andrew Colas.
Approved.
Ann Curry is absent. Ellen Ford is absent. Joe Gagne.
Yes.
Ross Carey.
Yes.
Chair Lillis.
Yes.
Laura Lee McIntyre.
Yes.
Jimmy Murray.
Yes.
Will Postian.
Yes, but I know I'm not supposed to say anything, but I do want to say something. I know that this 2.97 number is something that students and TFAB have said that they can live with. And live with and cope with are two different things. And I do want to say that moving towards the resident tuition, I am very, very concerned. And I really think we need to put all of our efforts in directing it towards the state to make sure that that number is not out of reach for students. Because that's going to be a big number, and I'm really nervous about it. And I think we all need to work to make sure that that number is not just unattainable for students.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Ralph.
Yes.
Mary Wilcox.
Okay, so the resolution carries. Any other comments before? We're going to take a lunch break now. I think that's correct, isn't it? Yes. Okay. Jamie, thank you. Great job. I would say when I think back to the gyrations we went through on tuition increases 4 years ago, this is like dramatically better process and much more thorough and much more transparent. We may still have a bad answer, but okay. Anything else? All right, we're going to recess for lunch. Call the meeting to order. Ben, thank you for being here. Karen, thank you for being here. We're skipping through the resolutions section, and we're going to go directly to the, as we always do, we have an area of an academic area in focus. And today it is, I love the material that you send out. It's comic studies, and some of those comic books must be priceless that were in those photographs. My gosh. Anyway, welcome. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I'm just here to introduce Ben. You should go to dinner at his house sometimes. He has a whole temperature-controlled room for his collection. It's locked, and it's a very special room. So Ben Saunders is a professor of English and a specialist in two fields that he connects in the most surprising and fascinating ways: the English Renaissance and the history of British and American comics and cartoons. As he'll tell you, Shakespeare was popular culture at the time, so this is no big stretch for him. He is the author of 2 books and the co-editor of 2 more, and he is one of the most frequently interviewed humanities faculty members on radio, television, and in podcasts. He appears in the History Channel documentary Superheroes Decoded. As he has developed our comic studies program at the U of O, Ben has expanded his scholarly efforts to include curatorial work, organizing 3 major art exhibitions for JSMA, and most recently the world premiere exhibition of Marvel, Universe of Superheroes at the Seattle Museum of Popular Culture, which broke attendance records. He is currently in discussions with the Victoria and Albert Museum in London about curating an exhibit there in 2020. Ben has brought excitement to our students and visibility to our campus. He is an award-winning teacher, and he created and directs the U of O program in comics and cartoon studies, the first undergraduate minor of its kind in the country. Other schools are now sending faculty here to work with Ben to find out how to set up a SMART program at their university. So I'm delighted that he's here today to talk to you about our program. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Karen. Ooh. This microphone is the perfect opportunity to do the Batman voice. I feel a little bit like, wow, is it feeding back? Hold it a little distance. I feel a little bit like the Captain Kirk just got called up in front of the Interstellar Federation board or something. And that's probably because I'm on large amounts of pseudoephedrine right now, so I apologize if this is a little looped. During Snowpocalypse last week, I was trapped with my daughter for 4 days, and she thinks there's nothing more amusing than sneezing in Daddy's face. So here I am. Anyway, what is comic studies? I have learned to expect confusion and maybe even some raised eyebrows at the very idea of comic studies. And some skepticism is only natural. After all, it really hasn't been that long since people in this country were encouraged to regard comic books as the very antithesis of educational. There's a little example right there for you, a magazine article from the Ladies' Home Journal in 1954, What Parents Don't Know About Comic Books. So, as some of you may already be aware, there was a moral panic around comics, started to get going in the late 40s and really accelerated in the 50s. The idea that reading comic books could retard intellectual development, corrupt morals, and contribute to juvenile delinquency was widely promulgated by journalists, politicians, and a handful of prominent psychologists during this period. And as a result, scenes like this were common all across the United States, as comics were burned by anxious parents and teachers in bonfires all around the country. There are many, many images like this that I could show you. This one is my personal favorite because of the expression on the face of that little boy in the middle back there. As that chamber of chills goes on top of the bonfire, you could see he is feeling it. So it's taken decades for the reputation of the art form to recover from these calumnies. But the educational merit of comic studies becomes apparent, I think, fairly quickly if we start to think seriously about the broader history, the international reach, the cultural impact, and the narrative sophistication of this remarkable medium. In fact, the short answer to the question, why study comics, might simply be to say that the art of comics is one of the most powerful forms of human communication ever devised. And so from that perspective, the appropriate question is not why study comics, but rather why haven't we been studying them for longer? And increasingly for educators, librarians, parents, and students, the issue is not whether we should be doing this, but how. What methodologies and approaches will best help us to appreciate, understand, and perhaps even prepare students for careers within this industry and art form. And here I am proud to say the U of O does stand at the cutting edge with our minor in comic studies, which was, as Professor Ford pointed out, the first in the country. Other places are imitating us now, but we will always have been the first. And the interdisciplinary nature of the minor allows us to come at the subject in a number of different ways. Now, one of the things we do in the minor is apply the scholarly principle that if you want to understand something, you need to know something about its history. So when I teach a course like, let's say, our Intro to Comic Studies, I like to begin by reminding students that comics are considerably older than most people imagine. In fact, comics and cartoons have occupied a central place in the visual culture of the United States since at least the late 19th century, when this particular example dates from. Cartoons like Richard Outcourt's Hogan's Alley, that was the name of this strip. Sometimes it was a single image with captions, sometimes it was a strip. And it's played a central role in Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst's bitter battles for superiority in the newspaper circulation wars, that some of you may remember from your history of media classes. The stars of the strip, like those of so many comic strips since, were children, specifically poor street urchins, little scrappers from the bottom of Manhattan's melting pot. Outcott used his cartoon to explore issues of class and ethnicity that had been aggravated within the buzzing urban consumerist environment of New York City at the turn of the century. Now, something interesting happened with his creation. So this is golf. The gag should be obvious, right? This is how the poor, mostly Irish immigrants of the Bowery play golf, and they play it, as you could see, aggressively. So this is a class joke. But the star of the strip was a character who became known as the Yellow Kid due to his yellow nightshirt with its ever-changing written message. And he gradually took over and became the figurehead and started the first comics-related merchandising bonanza in the United States. The kid's image would eventually appear on. So comics in America and the history of advertising are linked at sort of the origin point. So he would eventually appear on billboards, buttons, matchbooks, cigarette packs. Here he is selling everything from sporting equipment to gardening equipment. There's a Yellow Kid jigsaw puzzle. There were postcards. It's a cookie tin. That's a nice one. And my personal favorite is the Yellow Kid whiskey. Back in the days when you could use children to sell alcoholic beverages. There he is. There was even a doll. Of course, there was a doll. Now, you could probably already imagine the many scholarly subjects that we could approach through the history of a character such as the Yellow Kid and these cartoons. He's obviously an important figure in the history of commercial art and advertising and in the history of journalism, as well as within comics culture. And what's more, the cartoons themselves are strikingly revealing about different aspects of life in the last century. You'll notice, for example, that the kid's head is shaved. There's another instance there, what they did to the dog cat. What happens to adults in these strips is really interesting. They're usually figures of authority and laid low. But there's the social reality behind the image of the kid. So the shaven head is a class marker. It's a sign of poverty because head shaving was a common treatment for lice amongst children in New York's tenement ghettos at this time. So this photograph is a reminder of the social reality behind the strip and reveals something that we can otherwise forget about these cartoons, which is that they raise rather disturbing questions about what we used to find funny, even as they skillfully flatter, exploit, and sometimes critique the attitudes and prejudices of the 19th century audience. So there's some history, there's some sociology. Early American comics are also valuable just as pure aesthetic objects. The aesthetic pinnacle of the Sunday comic during this period, this is back in the day when newspapers were huge, right? Really big. The broadsheets were big. And when you folded something like this up, this was the color supplement that would have come on a Sunday. This strip only ever came out on Sundays. Winsor McKay could not have produced this on a weekly basis. He was also one of the first animators in the history of American cinema, and you could see the skills of the animator at work here in this strip that you're obviously meant to just fold out, put on the floor, and kind of fall into. Here's another example of his work. So this debuted in 1905, and I think is a major artistic achievement of the early 20th century in any medium. It's kind of pop art before Andy Warhol. There's a nice example of the bed. Every strip has the same plot. Nemo goes to bed, dreams, something spectacular happens, and then he wakes up at the end and says something like, I shouldn't have eaten that cheese, or whatever. So it's really an excuse for these visuals. Pop art before Warhol, psychedelic before psychedelia. McKay's dream images, I think, are the missing link between Lewis Carroll's deranged Victoriana and the acid-tinged animation of the Beatles' Yellow Submarine. But if you really want to pursue the origins of the comics form, we can go back much further than these early American examples. It's a bit of a cliche, I have to admit, within comic studies, to point out many elements of the modern comic are as old as cave painting, and therefore predate any of our surviving written literature by about 25,000 years. But let's see if I can make the point. So how about this? That's a detail, a close-up of the right-hand side of that image. And so the question here is, how many lionesses are we looking at? Since lionesses, I don't believe, tend to hunt in packs, it's reasonable to say that what we're looking at there is one lioness that has been moving quickly. And the way that the artist has attempted to convey movement and speed is by drawing multiple versions of the animal, a technique which you'd be familiar with from reading any number of comics, a technique which we apparently had mastered in the caves 25,000 years ago. Another example, a really neat one, this one. How many legs does that, whatever it is, bison, buffalo thing have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can count at least 9, 10 legs. As far as I know, the fossil record has never turned up the 10-legged buffalo, right? So what you have here, but this was painted, now remember, this is painted on an uneven cave wall. The surface is not flat. The only way of looking at these images at the time would have been through burning torchlight. Torchlight flickers. So when the light flickers, the legs move. So this is a 25,000-year-old example of animation on the walls of the cave, at least according to Professor Marc Azima, who's a professor of archaeology at the University of Toulouse-Le-Marais, who's written about these things. Now, amazing as these drawings are, and what I'm just trying to suggest here is that there are elements of modern cartooning on the walls of the caves. They lack some obvious elements that we tend to associate with comics, such as panel borders and text. You have to wait a little while for those. We first discovered them in the West in medieval manuscripts. This example dates from the early 12th century. It's a story of David and Goliath from St. Stephen's Bible. Note the artist's decision here to break the panel border to convey Goliath's size, anticipating a technique used in modern superhero comics by about 800 years. But it's with the growth of print culture that we start to find things that really look like our idea of modern comics. So here's a good example. Francis Barlow's A True Narrative of the Popish Plot, a broadside from 17th century England. So this would be a broadside printed on a single sheet with artwork on both sides. The Popish Plot, anyone remember this from a 17th century history class? No prizes for the Popish Plot. So this was an attempt to stir up ill will towards Catholics through defamatory rumors and falsehoods. So in sociological terms, you might think of this as the equivalent today of like an anti-Muslim video on YouTube or something. I mean, that was the goal of the people who created it, to stir up anti-Catholic feeling. But what I want you to notice is that all the conventions of the contemporary comic strip have been established by this ignominious piece of popular culture from the late 1670s. There's a narrative sequence of images reading from left to right and top to bottom, complete with word balloons and panel borders. It's a printed document, this is the other side, mass-produced and relatively inexpensive, and the content, as you can see, is anything but elevated. There you have an image of a supposed priest and spy and conspirator of the plot being flagellated on the buttocks there, because that's the sort of thing that Catholics get up to in the view of the people who produced this document. So, mass-produced, inexpensive, anything but elevated, word balloons, panel borders. It appeals to a mixture of the prurient and the partisan. Religious hatred, political scandal mongering. In my opinion, you need a very good reason not to call this a 17th century comic strip. So to summarize the historical portion, and I promise there's not too much more of my presentation, this is just a summary of the historical bit. So comics and cartoons have occupied a central place in the visual culture of the United States since the late 19th century. Comics in Europe can be traced back to at least the 17th century, and I say at least. Early comics are a fascinating and neglected resource for the exploration of historical and political issues that were of vital importance to the cultures that produced them. And they are often art objects of considerable aesthetic beauty and value. So besides being much older than most people realize, the comic art form is also, of course, global in reach. Different nations have established different creative traditions with regard to it, and it's also fundamentally interdisciplinary in scope, combining as it does both verbal and visual narrative elements. So another reason that the U of O is at the cutting edge of this field, and again, I'm proud to say this, is that we have recognized the international and interdisciplinary aspects of this form from the beginning. Through the minor in comic studies, we encourage students to take courses in comparative literature, art history, East Asian languages, Romance languages, all that focus on different aspects of world comics. This includes a class on the history of Japanese manga. Those of you who have been to Japan and know Japanese culture will be aware of what a comics culture it is, of course. And this is an entirely separate tradition from the American and English traditions. Taught by Professor Akiko Wally in art history. These are just some examples of the different kinds of manga, including cooking manga. That's just to give you a sense of how different comics culture is in Japan. We also offer a class called War in French Comics, taught by Professor Fabienne Moore in Romance languages. All the materials are in French, and the class counts for upper division French literature credit, as well as credit towards the comic studies minor. It's actually a really great way of teaching language as well as literature, because the language in the speech balloons is idiomatic French, the way French people actually talk. So it's very valuable from that point of view. We also offer a class called Comics, Colonialism, and Empire, which is taught in comparative literature by Professor Michael Allen, and which looks at the graphic novel representations of both Africa and the Middle East. So students who complete these classes emerge with a deeper understanding of several centuries of visual culture, not only in the United States, but also in Japan, France, and elsewhere around the globe. Now, what's more, as should already be clear from the different departments I've mentioned, the minor is proudly interdisciplinary in a way that few other fields can claim to be. Faculty in the College of Design, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the School of Journalism have all potentially something to bring to the table when it comes to instructing students about the history, interpretation, appreciation, and creation of comics. We've offered qualifying courses from an amazing range of disciplines. But I would like to bring this presentation to a close, and obviously I'd be willing to take any questions, by mentioning one of the more innovative classes in the creation of comics that we have offered. And that's Writing for Comics, which was first taught by Brian Michael Bendis, Portland-based writer, actually one of the very first people I ever invited to this campus back in 2006. One of the biggest names in the comics industry today. Brian is the co-creator. He steered the Avengers franchise for about 10 years. One of the reasons there are Avengers movies is because of Brian. He also is the co-creator of Jessica Jones. Some of you may be familiar with that Netflix TV series. And the co-creator of Miles Morales. That image hasn't reproduced very well, but if you saw Into the Spider-Verse, which just got nominated for an Oscar as Best Animated Movie, this is a character that he co-created. I'm trying to bring Brian back to campus in the fall, actually, to talk about that movie. So our success developing comic studies is even more remarkable when you consider, and I would like you to consider this, that prior to this current academic year, we did not have a single faculty member working full-time in this field. I myself am only half-time in this field. All those other classes I mentioned are people who are giving me one class a year, or sometimes one class every 2 years. We had nobody full-time in the field until the past fall, and our capacity to teach, produce, research, and train students in this rapidly growing discipline was greatly enhanced this past year with the hiring of Matt Johnson in creative writing, Matt being a very distinguished novelist, but who has also written for comics. He doesn't draw, but he has written for comics. New York Times best-selling author who was recently hired by creative writing. Matt is going to be able to give us one or maybe one class a year, maybe one every 2 years, teaching the writing for comics. And also Catherine Kelp-Stebbins, who just got hired in the Department of English and is the first time that we've actually hired somebody to teach comics full-time. And it would be remiss of me not to mention a couple of my most successful students. Natalie Nurigar, who actually didn't graduate from the minor because the minor was only established the year that she graduated, but she was one of my best students prior to that. She's currently a story artist for Disney, but what you're looking at there between gears was her undergraduate diary. She did a 4-panel strip every day for her senior year. As a discipline exercise, she just insisted that she would do 4 panels a day every day for her entire senior year, and before she graduated, Image Comics published it. And more recently, the fabulous Lauren Amaro, who just graduated and immediately got a job as an assistant editor at Marvel Comics. She chose the U of O because of the comic studies minor, and she's obviously one of the great success stories of the minor. So what is comic studies? It is an exciting new academic discipline with potential both as an area of research and as a path to creative vocational work. The U of O is one of the best places in the country to pursue this path. Our unique program presents students with the most comprehensive, coherent, and intellectually rigorous selection of undergraduate courses in the discipline. Major comics creators have taught for us in the program and regularly give guest lectures on the campus. And we have recently augmented faculty strength in these fields. Much, much, much needed strength in these fields. Our minor extends principles that are integral to the pedagogic mission of the humanities into new artistic and intellectual territories, and in so doing, it serves our long-term goal of sustaining a distinctive national reputation for innovation, creativity, and quality in the field of undergraduate education. It's not hyperbole, it's the truth to say that with continued investment, the U of O could be recognized as one of the top 5 schools in the world in this rapidly growing discipline. Thank you so much for your patient attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody may have.
How many students are participating in the minor? And I just think it was curious that the 2 students you highlighted were women. Because often you think of comics and you think of boys.
Well,
or young or men.
Yeah, I mean that might perhaps yes. I understand. I totally understand why you would say that. But if you go to any one of the conventions that's happening around the country at any weekend, you go to Rose City Convention in Portland in the fall. where 50,000 people will be there, it's 70% female.
Wow.
So yeah, that's a very I understand that why you would think that, but it's a much older perception of the nerd.
Yeah.
But I didn't answer your question. So between 30 and 50 students are enrolled in the minor in any given year, depending on how we're sort of cycling through the graduation rates. That's not it's the students who actually want to take the minor is a fairly that's a dedicated and smaller cohort. Students who want to take a class here or there that's a totally different set of numbers. So my history of the superhero class, for example, which I'm able to offer usually once every 2 years, I could offer that, and every year it's capped at 40. I could do it for 80 or 100 or 150 students every time I offer it. The Intro to Comic Studies, we could probably also capped at 40. We could offer that twice a term in English every term, and I suspect it would fill every single time. Now, not all of those students then go on to take the minor. And I didn't actually just look up where we're at, but I'd say between 30 and 50 is a reasonable bet at any given point in the graduation cycle.
Thank you.
How do you define cartoon? One of the things that I'm not seeing so much is like the history of political cartoons, but I'm sure you throw that in there. One of the more interesting classes we developed at one point for high school using music was using World War I sheet music covers as original source material to talk about propaganda. And those were they're interesting artwork as well as cartoon-ish characters, but how do you define cartoon, and where does that fit in? And can you bring Gary Larson and Calvin and Hobbes back, please?
Yeah, no, that's a really excellent question. So without wanting to get too down into the sort of the academic weeds, the issue of how the form is defined is one of the constant sources of argument within the field. Just what to call, whether it was an aggressive stance for me to say that we were going to call this comic studies and not comics and graphic novels or something like that, right? I hate the phrase graphic novel. It's a marketing category. It usually describes memoirs, which are not novels. The most famous graphic novel is probably Art Spiegelman's Mouse. That's not a novel. It's a memoir. So what graphic novels are fat comic books. Now, cartoon is a different thing again, because cartoon can mean animation, and it can also mean the single panel gag. And there are definitions of the comics forms where some people exclude things like the single panel gag. They insist you need sequence in order to really be in the realm of the comic. You have to have at least 2 images. I don't actually subscribe to that, because that would rule out, amongst other things like the Family Circus or Gary Larson, and something that seems so obviously to be partaking of comics, excluded by an overly strict definition. So again, you see how down in the weeds we could go with that, and how people can write dissertations about that kind of thing if they want to. The point that I would make, I guess, is that this is a question really of resources. I would love to teach more about the newspaper strip. I would love to have more people teaching about the history of editorial cartoons and political cartoons. Imagine being at the start of a field, like let's say film studies, and you are the person who does it. And this is an international global art form with over 100 years worth of history. And people say, yeah, you teach that. Right? This is not something that really can be adequately managed. There's no one person's knowledge that could do this. One of the reasons that I don't do more with the editorial cartoon is that I just don't know enough about it. One of the wonderful things about being here is that when it comes, a lot of people at a lot of schools, when they do a graphic novels class or a comic studies class, especially in a semester system where they have a few extra weeks, they make the mistake of trying to do everything, and they'll have newspaper strips at the beginning and some manga at the end, right? And I never teach manga. I never teach Japanese comics, because I don't know anything about Japan. But I have friends on the faculty here in East Asian languages and art history who speak Japanese, read Japanese, read manga growing up, understand the relationship of manga to larger aspects of Japanese culture. They can teach that stuff, and I don't have to pretend that I know it as well as I know the American and the British traditions. Yes.
How successful is your career placement? Do you have a feel for what percentage of those who do choose the minor go on into a career that's related in some way to comics, either writing or film?
Sure.
Many.
That's another really good question. So the minor is very young, right? We only started taking students into the minor in 2012. So the first time people could realistically graduate from it would have been 2015, 2016. We have been tracking. I've kept in touch with students that have done astonishingly well, like Natalie and Lauren. We don't have anyone actually tracking everybody going through and graduating with the minor. No one's doing that, as far as I know. I could tell you, though, that when it started out, I actually didn't try. I didn't want everybody to know about it. I didn't know whether we'd be overwhelmed. And so it was very low-key about, it's like, there's a comic studies minor, but don't tell anybody. And the largest number of students who took the classes at the beginning were students in English because they knew me, and I'm in the English department, and so the majority of students taking the minor were English students. As the minor has grown, I've noticed that the single largest denomination of majors is actually digital arts students. And that's something, because that's the arts and technology program has one of the most demanding majors in terms of credit. So the fact that they want this is really interesting to me. But they are interested in visual storytelling. They're interested in comics, as most of them are interested in animation careers. So digital drawing, digital animation. And they recognize that comics is a fantastic place to learn about about visual storytelling. So they're coming to us in increasing numbers. And I could say more about that. I mean, in the long run, if I were getting to fantasize about the vision of the future, would it involve actually having more faculty, a dedicated line in the College of Design? Because that's what we don't have. We have someone in creative writing teaching the writing of comics. We don't have someone with industry experience teaching digital drawing of the drawing of comics. And that's what everybody wants. That's what every parent asks about at the conventions when I'm there. It's what everybody wants. Are there classes in drawing comics?
Other questions for Ben? Ben, over the course of 2 years, how many different courses in comic studies could be offered?
It's sky's the limit. I mean, it would depend on the I don't mean to be glib, right? I mean, it really does depend on the way in which comics are being used within the discipline. You could have classes being offered in art, classes being offered in philosophy, classes being offered in. Now, I would have to if it were just really, it is starting to expand that way. And if I were really thinking about it, we would have to be thinking about what's the difference between doing comic studies and having a course which asks you to read a couple of graphic novels, right? And there should be, I think, a measurable difference. But at the moment, we're offering classes in art history, creative writing, English, folklore. What am I forgetting? We have in the past offered classes in ethnic studies. Cinema studies and adaptation is a potential class that Priscilla keeps telling me she's going to do and then never quite has time to do.
So there are many options.
Many options.
Yeah.
Many options. Yes.
Is this part of the core education, or could it be considered? It seems like these are wildly popular courses and have inherent appeal to folks that grow up with comics, or are just interested from a kind of a popular perspective. How do you see your courses sort of integrating with a larger complement of core?
Oh, sure. I mean, well, the Intro to Comic Studies is a general education satisfying course because it teaches students to think. It teaches visual literacy, and it's teaching students to think about the both aesthetic aspects of representation and the political implications of acts of representation. So, I think of the Intro to Comic Studies as being a real anchor point for the humanities in general. Other classes can get very special. You get very specialized. I mean, I teach a class on the history of the American superhero that begins in the 1930s, and students are actually quite shocked sometimes when they take it as to how demanding it is. But that's a class that that's maybe more likely to appeal to a cultural studies person, an English major, a history major, a sociology person who's looking for some interesting ways of thinking about how America has been talking to itself about nationalism or masculinity for the last 100 years. So those are very nuanced, but perhaps not for everybody questions. But visual literacy seems to me that's a kind of a thing for everybody.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
I'm going to turn the mic off now then.
Thank you all. One more Darth Vader impression.
Thank you. So I'm supposed to leave now, right? Thank you all. Unplugging.
And I think we're going to do 10 next. Right?
We are. We just need a second to switch the computer back, and then Professor Dewey's here. So.
I walked in and I was all on bills, and I know I had a jacket in my bag.
Thanks, Ben, again.
We have this.
Welcome, Tim.
Dewey.
I know. Welcome, Tim Dewey. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
I think we've all heard from Tim before. The professor of economics. Tim does a lot of work in economic impact research and studies, and is going to take us through the economic impact in several versions of the University of Oregon. And this, of course, is of great interest to us as we try to make sure everybody understands the value of the university and the kind of, I know this isn't a term you love, but the multipliers of university activity. So your report was complete, I would say, but we do have some questions, I'll bet. So Tim, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your message.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to present this work. We've been working on it for quite a long time. It's got a clever title, right? Your economic impact. I'm not great with titles. So I wanted to start about what is covered in a traditional economic impact report. And generally what we're trying to do is identify the spending associated with the university. This is probably the best way of trying to compare apples to apples across university. And so when we're thinking about the spending associated with the university, we're thinking about some of the obvious things, the direct university spending. And that would include spending on just about everything we do, like research, classroom, athletics, auxiliary units, all of those types of activities that fall under the budget. Student spending. So specifically student spending that's not captured above. So, for example, some of the student spending flows into auxiliary units such as dorms, food services, and so that's already captured once in the university numbers, and we're trying not to double count that number. Then there's visitor spending, and I'll be honest here, we probably don't have the best data on visitor spending. We've had some good data from athletics over time, where we've been able to track where some of the season ticket holders are coming from. And so that gives us some insight onto certain aspects of visitor spending. But we also don't know how many students are being visited by their parents every year. And so we're making some assumptions around that. And then there's construction spending. And this tends to be a somewhat volatile component. It could be $120 million one year and $80 million another year. It just varies as the construction activity changes. My experience over the last several years that we've been running, I'm going to say $100 million a year of new construction. So that's what we're looking at. What's not covered is things that are not direct spending. And it's not that these things aren't important. It's that when you start opening up the door to these things, basically anything becomes fair game in a sense. You really can't compare universities very well. So, for example, human capital. We know we're creating human capital. How much human capital? What's our contribution? How does that compare to other universities? That's a very difficult question to get at. Connections with the business community. Goodwill with the community in general. All these are important economic impacts and things that are part of the story, but are not generally considered part of an economic impact report. I will say that community colleges often add some kind of human capital aspect in, partly because they think they can track down their workers more closely with the local community and the local workforce, partly because their spending numbers are fairly low in comparison to, say, a regular university, that the economic impact actually looks fairly limited unless you include some of those things. So what we're trying to do is compare apples to apples with some of this work, and specifically that, I'll stop there for a second. I'd gone to a conference now 5 or 6 years ago, APLU conference, and one of the pushes that we were receiving was trying to get to an apples and apples type comparison. So that's what I've been trying to do here. If you want to interrupt me and ask questions, that's fine, by the way, because I've had a lot of coffee today, and I'm just going to keep going until someone stops me. Not all spending is new economic impact, and that's a fact that many studies fail to acknowledge. And this is really what the APLU is trying to get at. A lot of spending is arguably just rearranging the deck chairs within the state. So whether money is spent here or in Portland, from the state's perspective, might not be a very big difference. What we really want to do is try to capture economic activity or new economic activity that we are responsible for. And that's what we're really thinking about as economic impact. Now that said, I have to consider this broader sorts of spending. And the reason is because most economic impact reports are written that way. So I would put us at a disadvantage if I didn't have a number that was really directly comparable to other universities. So even though this is the kind of the way the APLU would like us to move, I can't make all the other universities make that move in that direction. So I've provided two numbers, right? Just because it's for me it's more accurate to do the right thing, but I have to make sure that we have the right information out there relative to other universities. So when I think about the overall overall spending, I'm calling that an economic footprint. That's leaving some impression on the Oregon economy, but it's sort of not necessarily new economic activity. What we really think of as the economic impact is really the revenues that we're bringing in from outside the state. So that's the distinction I make in this report.
And just to clarify, you're talking about the impact on the Oregon economy only, right? You're not talking about the impact in other states that's
No.
generated as a function of
No.
U of O activity?
Correct. This
Yep.
is just on the Oregon economy in general, and you could, in fact, narrow it down and do
Eugene.
more close to the Lane County economy. And the impact of the Lane County economy would be bigger than on the Oregon economy.
Right.
Some of the Lane County impact leaks out to the broader Oregon
Yeah.
economy. So you can really do a lot of interesting things if you want to get pages and pages of numbers, and then the communications people have to figure out what's the most important thing on that. But this I think is a way that we could get to all the things that I think are most important and provide information that I think is comparable. Now, there's another way I think about this. In sort of the economic development lingo, I would call the university a traded sector firm. So basically an operation that works outside of its geographic boundaries. And that's basically a firm that's going to, on net, bring in new resources from outside the community. And that's really those new resources that we're thinking of as economic impact. Now, what are those resources? Well, I think we're all familiar with them, whether it be non-resident tuition, federal research dollars, visitor dollars from outside of Oregon. All of those kinds of things would be considered really bringing new economic impact to the state. Without those revenue sources, we would be a smaller operation. Smaller operation would do less stuff for the Oregon economy. So how do I capture that? There's been a couple of ways in the literature to try to do it. One approach is to prorate our spending by the percentage of non-resident students. I think that's a very common approach. It makes some sense. I think it makes more sense in our case to prorate by the percentage of tuition from outside of the state, because there is a substantially more percentage of tuition from outside of the state, and does a better job of representing our outreach, I think, to the broader economy. So that's about 67% of tuition and fees are attributable to non-residents. And so what I'm doing here is using the convention of saying our basic product is education. The basic demand from education comes from tuition dollars. The out-of-state portion of that tuition dollars represents the money that we're really drawing in and supporting and creating economic impact with in the state. Obviously, if I used 50%, which would be closer to the number of out-of-state students we have, that would reduce the impact. I've done that in the past following another convention. I don't think that's really the most accurate way to represent our impact in the community. So now a lot of the calculations and details you have in the report, that's a fairly large revision that I did several years ago and have been updating over time. It gives you some idea of really what our spending was for 2017, 2018. So the university's direct expenditures, and I pull these numbers out of our financial reports. Again, that's a common way to do it, because most of these things are consistent accounting methods across universities. And then you subtract off certain elements like depreciation, which would be a non-cash expense. And so we don't want to include that as something creating economic impact. And then you basically hit it with a multiplier. And so the idea of a multiplier is that the spending that you do gets multiplied through the community because you're spending because someone else's income, which is somebody else's spending, which is somebody else's income. That is a bit of a controversial issue because the choice of your multiplier can impact the size of the output, the size of the impact. The multiplier here used is just under 2. I would personally say 2 is pretty much the max you should expect. I think beyond 2 is pushing into more questionable realms of empirical viability, and I think that's the consensus among people that are seriously considering this. Some other universities in the state have been able to back out or using something more like 2.3. I would say that that's probably excessive, but there it is. So if I apply that to the output number, the direct expenditures number, we get for the university spending about $1.6 billion of output created from that $836 million of spending. That would be what the footprint would be, I would call. A lot of other places would call that the economic impact. What I would call the economic impact is the second number, which is the direct expenditures prorated for the number of out-of-state revenue from tuition and fees. And that number would be then output of $1.1 billion. So again, how you use these numbers, I work with communications to figure out what the most effective way is to use these numbers to create comparisons with other universities.
And Tim, just for clarification, what are 2 or 3 things that would be included in direct expenditures for footprint, but not included in direct expenditures for impact?
So you would be thinking here that if it was a resident student from Oregon, that would not be included in your impact, but would be included in your footprint. So that would be sort of a distinction. So we could make the argument, by the way, it becomes a little bit harder to make, and I'm sure I could work out something with Roger, but you could make this story that some of those tuition dollars are actually reclaimed, that they would be otherwise leave the state if the student didn't have the University of Oregon as an alternative. Now, justifying that would be a little bit of difficulty, but there's wiggle room in that space as well. Certainly.
Tim, are you saying when we compare, like other universities say they have a certain economic impact, they might be using footprint and they might be using a bigger multiplier?
They're almost certainly using footprint, and they may be using a bigger multiplier.
Okay, so it's not apples to apples in any way, shape, or form, probably.
That's I can't. There is no apples to apples, unfortunately.
Yep.
I assume that if you pay a consultant more, you'll get a bigger number. There's different programs that do different things. Like I sort of backed out some of the OSU numbers, and I can find it in their financial reports. I see where they're coming from. Then I can back out the multiplier, so it's not that complicated from that perspective.
So a resident student who gets a federal scholarship.
So, very good question, right? Because some of those monies, again, are from outside the state, and that's what we're trying to capture by prorating that number. Are we under-capturing or over-capturing? We're exactly in that space of there's gray area there. And that's why, again, I try to give these various outlooks, because I'm trying to capture something that's closer to what I think is true impact, so that you'll just know that. One of the reasons, too, is that if I would want people to know this, because if any reporter ever challenged us on what do these numbers really mean, that we understood what the numbers meant. I did have a reporter once that did challenge this issue and said, look, if I take all these economic impact studies that come across my desk and add them up, I've got more output than we get in this region. And she was right. And that's the factor of using these footprints as economic impact rather than trying to dig down into the underlying numbers. But you're in that zone where what's the right dollar to track and where to track it. 70%, close to 70% of expenditures coming from out of state, that's probably not too far off a reality. When I think, too, that there's also a state contribution of whatever, $67 million. So, I think we're pretty close to the right number there. Then there's student spending. Students spending is, again, split into on-campus versus off-campus spending. Some of the rent, housing, and food is captured in our auxiliary units, so we don't want to double count that. But a considerable number of our students, 18,000 students, are living off campus. and they're paying rent, and they're buying food, and they're buying haircuts, and all the other things that you buy at when you're a student, and books and supplies. And our estimates of that are really based upon what the admissions says is the cost of living in Eugene. So becomes the basis for our cost of what the students are paying. And according to admissions, they regularly survey their students to see if they're in the right zone. Right? In the report, I report on some other universities, some other comparisons. Some universities have a low tier of spending and a high tier of spending, or present low tier of spending and a high tier of spending. My sense is, given that the number of Maseratis I see on campus, this might be a low number, a conservative number. So,
those are all faculty cars, Tim.
I'm sorry?
Those are all faculty cars.
Those are all faculty cars. Those are the Porsches. So I think that this is a conservative number. So I'm comfortable saying our students are putting $262 million or so into the community, and that's mostly in the local community. So that's a sizable amount of money. Now, you have to adjust some of these numbers because some of this is basically passed throughout a community. So, for example, margins at food stores, right? So we have to sort of we reduce the amount of spending on food on the belief that some of that spending really passes right through the community and out to an end producer. So there's a bit of an adjustment for that. And when you make that adjustment, you end up with a spending of about $200 million after those margin pass-throughs. About half of that's from out-of-state students. And so here we've chosen to use that as a way to distinguish between the footprint and the impact. The impact for Lane County is going to be pretty high. It's going to be somewhere between those two numbers because you've got Portland residents coming down now to Lane County and spending in Lane County. So again, that number might wash out across the state, but it would be would intensify here. And there's a section in the report where I've done some estimates on those Lane County specific impacts.
And so, how much of the $97 million is non-resident tuition?
So none of that's tuition. That's all just out-of-pocket spending.
This is all out of pocket.
This is
no
all
tuition.
out-of-pocket spending. So this is rent. So this is outside of that. And so that's $1 million, at least $1 million dropped into the local economy after adjusting for margins from out-of-state students, and that's not insignificant, certainly. So that gives us numbers too. We hit those things with multipliers to get an idea of what the total output is associated with those kinds of activities, the students' activities. We have some estimates on tourism activity coming from things like football games, basketball games, an assumption. We have visitors. Roger's provided me numbers of visitors from out of state who come and tour the university. We have an estimate that every student gets a 2-day visit from their parents, out-of-state students. So, that's included there. And then we use numbers that are provided from basically the Oregon Travel Department on how much Oregon visitors to Oregon spend, and use those to come up with $30 million or so of spending that we can track down as visitor spending from a footprint perspective. And so we're thinking about that as well. Yes. So I'm trying to think, is there anything else there? There are one-off events that are, so Olympic trials, for example, will create a surge of activity. We tend to think that those things do not really change the supply chain in the local economy because you don't change the supply chain for one-off events. So they become really temporary boosts in jobs and income, but really not persistent boosts. Whereas I would say the consistency of the football games and the knowledge of the local community that those things are going to happen 7 times a year creates a lot more a capacity to build up a supply chain around that. So there's a little bit of distinction here. Extra economic impact on some years that if you track down those other events. And then we have construction. And we talked about that being about $100 million a year, and that you just pop through a little multiplier. And when we do this this calculation, what we get is 2 different numbers here. And one of those is the footprint, which is about $2.2 billion in the economy. So I describe this as we're shaping about $2.2 billion of economic activity in the state. We're creating probably about $1.5 billion of new economic activity in the state as a result of being a traded sector firm that brings in revenue from outside the state. And another place that people ask is, well, how many jobs? Somewhere around 22,000, 23,000 jobs, probably associated with the economic activity of the University of Oregon. Probably about 15,000 of those jobs are new jobs associated as a result of our work. And so that's the kind of distinction we're trying to make here. Most places will probably use, again, that $2.2 billion as your economic impact and your jobs as 23,000 jobs associated with 23,000 jobs. But again, I think the better way to think about it is about 1.5 billion of new economic impact and about 15,000 new jobs is the more accurate way to consider these numbers. And I think those are I kind of moved through that relatively quickly because I thought maybe you'd have some questions about that. Jamie.
I know you've been doing this type of analysis for a long time. How has our numbers changed over the years? Have they grown? Have they been stable?
So I've done a little methodological shifts along the way, so I've got to put that in the back of my mind. The last few years have been fairly stable. So as we know, the number of students has fallen, and so that creates a drag on the student impact, but then we get a little bit more revenue, and so we get a little bit more spending. So the numbers have been climbing up a little bit from the university's perspective, but falling a little bit from the student's perspective. Obviously, the big jump we made was in the late, around the time of the recession when we boosted our student body by 5,000 students. And that was a fairly big shift. But until you grow more, you don't get much more impact. So coming online, which will again feed into these numbers, or for example, the spending on the night campus, which is already showing, I think it's showing up in some of the construction numbers already, but then as it gets more spending associated with that, will show up in the year over spending numbers as well. So that'll be where those things show up in this.
A question about I think the chart just before this one. Mm-hmm. So let's say there's a construction project. I'm just trying to make sure I understand this. And it's funded half by state tax dollars and half by private gifts.
Yeah. So I've assumed that all of this is impact rather than footprint here. That is fairly consistent with other methodologies. I don't know what spending would have happened in the absence of the university in some of these cases. So I kind of made the assumption here that it's all impact rather than footprint. I think that's probably the right way to think about it. But you're right, is that it might be the case that some of that could have been spent on a different project somewhere else in the state, and so it would be some a little bit of a wash.
And then if I went on with the construction example, and in one case we build a power plant, and in another case we build a classroom building, And if I were doing financial analysis to get to the value added, I would do some kind of discounted cash flow NPV, but you don't do that.
We're
here.
not doing that in this.
You
this
apply
type of
basically a
analysis.
multiplier.
This is just the spending that goes out the door.
Got it.
And so this is a little bit different than
Yep.
than that kind of analysis. That is exactly correct.
Thank you.
And I'm trying to think if I've ever seen within the concept of an economic impact report that kind of analysis, and I don't think so. Most of it's just straight, here's the spending, here's the impact associated with it.
So, obviously, given some of the topics we've been discussing today about the state and its failure to fund us, one of the things I was wondering is, a couple questions. One is, you're able to restrict your analysis to Lane County?
Yes.
If you wanted to.
Right.
And are you able to say, you're also presumably able to say how much of the economic activity of Lane County is attributable to the University of Oregon?
Yes, you could you use a value-added number and compare that to the gross domestic product of the county.
So that's something we could ask you to do.
You could.
And would it be large or small? Would I be surprised how small it is, or would I be surprised how large it is? Of course, you have to know what I'd be surprised when I take it out.
I don't know off the top of my head, but I could probably give some quick estimates off of some stuff I've done. So let me get back to you on that.
Okay, that'd be interesting. Another thing that'd be interesting is, as you probably know, and I talked about earlier, we get funded by the state the least of all of the public universities in the state. I'm wondering, do you have an ROI? Can you do a comparison ROI of each of the universities on the state?
I'm cautious on that. You can do, so one thing that some places do, and it's talked about in the report, is, and we've done in the past, and it's something I've tried to move us away from, is you can do, here is the economic output per dollar of state spending. The only challenge with that, and the way I try to dissuade people from doing it, is if you lower state spending, you get a bigger ROI in that calculation, because we've been able to push the expenses on the students. And so that's where I get a little bit cautious, because if you actually raise the spending, so if the state gives us more so that we can lower tuition, our ROI will go down by that measure. And that's what I'm trying not to get us too far into. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because it's a little bit different. Again, it gets to the sort of question about cash flow analysis and that sort of thing. When we do these sorts of exercises, I think that you can get some weird results. Clearly, if the state wants the most impact, biggest ROI is to cut our contribution and let us try to make that up from external sources. And so I'm just wary of them figuring that out.
Where does the role of the university as a venue renter fit into this impact?
A venue renter?
Yeah.
Oh, so that's going to end up in the general spending activity. So, for example,
we rent venue out, not we go rent venue. So Matt Knight Arena.
Right. That ends up in the overall budget activity. So when the financial reports aggregate all our activity up, that's going to aggregate up athletics and any associated revenues that come in with that.
Really? Yeah, but I think, just based on my knowledge, I think it would probably show the net of what we get.
Yes.
But I think what you're referring to is we'll hold a concert, and
Yeah.
all these people come for the concert, and maybe the
Yes,
promoters, the
arguably-
artists, they all get money.
Arguably, that's going to fall under the tuition, the visitor aspect of it, and then we have to get into the issue. Well, did those visitors come from outside Lane County or outside of Oregon? I'm thinking most of those visitors are internal to Oregon. My experience, And there's the other little complication there too. Not to say I thought about this a lot or we think about this a lot, but the other little complication too is that did we take spending away from another Lane County venue? Becomes a little bit of an issue there. So, I've gone to the concert at Matt Knight Arena instead of doing something else locally. So that's these little transfer things that become a little bit more complicated, especially dealing with these local types of events. So, but again, something that's more interesting is you bring in 1,000 or 1,000 athletes and their families from outside the country.
Yeah.
There's going to be some activity that's associated with that I've got to imagine showed up in the I know showed up in the athletic department's impact reports or what they presented for getting these events here at the university. So that's certainly something that we do that's important as well.
You might have just kind of touched on this, but I was curious about like external grants and where those kind of fall into.
Those are going to end up being, again, sort of this idea that we're bringing in these external spending. So that's the idea of prorating the spending by some external number. So that's where, again, the impact, at least from the spending impact, what we get is grant money and out-of-state tuition money and out-of-state federal aid and all of those things are creating the impact. So the grant money is great for the research money is great for the local economy in the short run, and I think in the long run, because that's the research that we do is sticky to the local community. Right? Where the students are educated, they leave the local community. In many cases, research is stickier and is going to contribute more to the local economy in the long run.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Tim?
What do we do with this?
Yeah.
Have we done to Kyle? I mean, how is this played in Peoria? Who reacts to this?
We're going to look at a couple of different audiences. I think first and foremost would be in the state legislature and really working with back groups. And Hunter and I are already meeting and looking at how we leverage that during this session. Then we'll look at also how we can leverage it from a public relations perspective as well. And that piece that will be, we're sitting down next week and start mapping out our strategy on that. So Tim's really, I think we've got this in the last week or two. Now we're sitting down and saying,
Okay, so we have to date, this is the first time we've tried to do this and we haven't done anything to date. I didn't know if you, Tim, you did this every year? Or...
We do this every other year.
Every other year, yeah.
And so we have made publicity of it, and it does go to the legislature. And Kyle and Hans know that if they want me to talk to legislators about it, I'm more than happy to do that.
So when you say it goes to the legislature, in the past, a piece of paper has been mailed to them? They get a piece of email? How does it go?
I'm not going to talk. That's not my decision. But it's a piece of paper. I've seen it.
There's an advocacy group that you can share with Living in Ponds. They have plans. There's an Around the O story that was published today on Around the O, and they will send it directly into the hands of advocates and lawmakers to highlight it.
It strikes me, though, as we think about this, there needs to be some comparison or base. The thing when I always read these reports, every university at BENEC comes out with numbers that are astounding and wonderful and exciting, and you don't know how to draw a baseline, right, between what's big, what's little, what should change. So that's why I was asking some of the questions about how do you compare and contrast. One possibility would be, by, changes, but then as you said, it's a complicated thing, because if we get cut by the legislature or don't get increased and then pass it on through tuition, that tells you it's not, you may end up with no change, but your big change.
Yeah, that's
in distribution.
So the way I've gone about this is, in general, the numbers are in some sense fairly consistent. Is that if you know what the university's budget is, then don't worry about the impact and just say that's just something Tim cares about, and you're just being nice to oblige me. And just look at the footprint. Generally take their budget numbers, their spending numbers, and double it, and that's going to be their impact on average. So I was doing this for OSU. Their budget's a little bit bigger than ours, and they hit it with a multiplier of 2.3 instead of 2 like I use. And that gives them their whatever economic impact that they associate with it. And so I can back out a lot of these numbers fairly quickly. Actually, I found the OSU number fairly quickly as far as how to do it, and I can actually back that right into our financial reports too. So I can do a little bit of that work for you, and I'll pull some of those numbers together because I think that I can get at least not worrying about the student spending part of it. That's a little bit more complicated, but the baseline numbers I can pull some apples to apples numbers for you, and then how much you magnify that really is going to depend upon the impact. But some of it's fairly straightforward as far as just the schools with the bigger budgets will have bigger impacts.
Jamie?
So I'm curious because early on you talked about how you're trying to do the more tangible stuff, and so you're not doing human capital and goodwill and all that stuff. But one of the things I worry about, or I feel like in my conversations with legislators, is they're very focused on how many residents are we educating, which is great. But they often are not focused at all on the fact that, at least I believe, we bring a lot of amazing people to the university, and then they want to stay in Oregon, and they graduate, and they stay in Oregon, some of them at least, and then they own businesses, and they work, and they pay taxes, and that piece of it feels like I can explain it, but there's nothing to quantify
and
it. Is there any way to
quantify it?
Yeah.
So you can, and hopefully if we had better data about where our students ended up, you could start to do a better story about that. And I believe the IRS data is supposed to start giving us some better insight into that. And that would be something, again, that once we start having the data, we can start telling a story around adding and building upon this type of report. And I guess that's the thing that an issue I've tried to emphasize is I think that this is one part of our story, and I think the story you're telling is another part of the story, and I think the research activity is another part of the story. And there's all these various parts of the story that are really filtering into our broader economic impact, and we have to think about how to aggregate all those stories, right? And that's hopefully we're going to get some data on exactly that issue. Because in theory we have, in the background there's a Social Security number, and there's wages, and there's the data has got to be out there. It's just an issue of how do you pull it back. So I'm hoping that we're going to start getting some of that data so we can start thinking about that question. There's also an interesting, again, a thing that I've always been a little bit wary about going down is we also have a lot of students, a lot of college-educated students that migrate to the Oregon from other universities, right? And so, is it cheaper to rely on them? And, that's an interesting sort of broad question, and so there's lots of things there. And then you're also going to find out that some people are unhappy because we educate students and they leave. Right? And so there's a lot of give and take in there, but I think that we can use some of that information that you're thinking about if we had some better data.
Any other questions for Tim? Thank you very much, Tim.
Pleasure.
It was terrific. You're probably going to get a lot of requests after this. So. Okay. I think the only thing left on our agenda are the resolutions that came to us as seconded motions from yesterday's committee meeting. So, Mary, do you want to just remind us briefly about the...
Absolutely.
Okay.
Our committee has a seconded motion that actually is in our materials, page 70. I just pulled it out. That we approved making permanent an amendment that was temporarily approved by the president in December to change the student conduct code, to amend the student conduct code to better reflect not only our actual practices but best practices as well. And essentially it was that an assessment would be made and notice will be given only when the assessment has made the determination that formal charges should be the process for formal charges should be started rather than giving notice for all kinds of.
Okay, and all of that was in your
Yeah, it's
material,
all-
including red line versions of it,
Right.
so.
Page 70, and our committee is moving it forward to the full
Okay,
board.
so it is a motion that has been seconded, so let's vote on it. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, let's go to, do you want to go through the FFP?
Sure. Oops. Excuse me. We have two motions that were approved by the Finance Committee, come to you as seconded motions. The first was the naming of an outdoor space, actually a terrace off of the third floor of the new Tykeson Hall in recognition of generous gift by George and Connie Slape. That comes to you approved by the Finance and Facilities Committee and for your vote to approve its naming. And that is in the package.
Okay, so all of you, the materials in the book, all those in favor? Aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the ayes have it.
And the last
the
one,
Zerk?
ZIRC, the Zebrafish International Resource Center. We were recently approached by the NIH with an opportunity to apply for a grant for updating and renovating and modernizing the ZIRC. This is something, they approached us, so we feel pretty good about the opportunity. It would be an $8.6 million project, being more than $5 million. It would need to be approved by the board. This will be a contingent approval in that the project will only go forward if we do, in fact, receive the grant. So that was approved by the Finance and Facilities Committee and comes to you as a seconded motion.
And once again, there was a lot of information in your material. So let's, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, we're done. Any other, we've completed the agenda. Any other, any other comments?
Comments are allowed.
Okay, let's have a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Okay, we're adjourned.